close your eyes and prepare for an interstellar journey unlike any other. Feel the weightlessness as we explore the universe's most tranquil exoplanets, each with its own unique, calming symphony. Click play to unlock your ultimate escape and discover the true meaning of cosmic serenity. They called it the pale horizon before they knew what to call it at all. A pale crescent in the long-range survey, a whisper of light between two far stars. When the survey ship Asterion glided close enough for the first probes to take their measurements, the planet's surface looked like a calm face turned to the cosmos. Sheets of frost that shivered but did not crack. Low ridges like the ripples left by wind on a sleeping sea, and a sky that held light with a kind of steady, indifferent patience. This is a story about people who landed there, not to fight monsters or to mine treasure, but because curiosity was the kind of hunger that could be fed slowly by long observation, small discoveries, and the long, soft rearranging of memory. It is a story of quiet evenings, of the way ships make their own weather, and of a world that listened more than it spoke. Commander Ilya Navarre had spent 2 decades among engines and checklists. He had learned how to speak clearly into a loop of static and how to read the faint tremor of a pump through the hull. Yet, in the weeks before the descent, he felt an unexpected hush take residence in him. The performance boards, the mission briefings, the simulated contingencies, they all became smaller against the idea of arriving somewhere that wanted only to be waited for. Not every place in the universe moves quickly, Dr. Amara Javed, the ship's psychologist, said one evening while they watched pale auroras ripple along the outer atmosphere. Her voice was softer than the lights and steadier than any cadence of warning. Some places ask nothing of us but time. Time was something the crew of the Asterion had in moderated supply. Their mission profile permitted extended study if the target promised interesting geologies or biosignatures. Lyra 7, the sterile designation that would become the pale horizon, promised small anomalies, crystalline veins that bent light in odd ways, magnetic fields that hummed at frequencies their instruments had to be coaxed into measuring. It promised above all a mystery that required being still. They were 9 who first set foot on the pale horizon. They called themselves by their roles when the practicalities of life in a small ship demanded clarity: pilot, xenobiologist, geochemist, systems engineer, 2 technicians, a botanist, the psychologist, and Commander Navarre. None of them expected an adventure of the kind told in theaters. There would be no heroics and no rescue beacons, only the slow, careful intimacy of observation. The ground was gentler than their simulations had suggested. Gravity, slightly less than Earth's, made movements elongate, and steps felt like the patient taking of breath. Their suits tasted of antiseptic and cold, the kind of cold that does not burn, but rather lays the world down in exactitudes. What they noticed first were the filaments. At the mouths of shallow hollows and along crystalline veins, thin, translucent filaments spiraled in lattices. They shimmered faintly when light brushed them, and produced harmonic vibrations when instruments played across them. When the xenobiologist Seina Kato first brushed a gloved finger across one, she did not expect to feel anything other than the slight tug of static. Instead, she felt a hush come into her mind like a curtain closing softly after a performance. Then an image arrived: a pebble-strewn beach, a distant twin moon, a woman folding a child's blanket with an expression of careful contentment. She pulled her hand back and blinked. The image washed away, leaving behind the aftertaste of salt and the memory of a small kindness she had never received. Her palms sweat under the glove. She recorded the event calmly, clinically, but when she slept that night, she dreamed of a coastline and woke with the exact memory of the sound of the tide. The filaments did not speak in the way human conversation does. They did not command. They offered. They interfaced with perception in a way that made personal history feel like a shared room in which someone else had left their coat behind. The crew would eventually learn that touching or listening to a filament did not plant foreign memories so much as rub away the dust on stories that felt, in the moment, entirely their own. They tried strict protocols at first: gloves, buffer sequences, neuromonitoring. Equipment logged heart rates and EEG patterns. The ship's AI recorded everything in triplicate. Yet protocols cannot fully account for the way people drift toward small comforts. Sena would slip away to the shallow hollows with a handheld recorder, claiming she only needed to catalog patterns. Lewis, the geochemist, found himself following veins of glassy mineral and humming the old children's songs his grandmother once mouthed. Simple things began to change. Conversation stretched long into the observation deck's late hours, and the mess table developed its own particular quiet. The planet did not take, it offered. A filament might show Commander Navarre a kitchen from a childhood he had never had, a small window where rain wrote slow, familiar letters on the sill. Dr. Javed might receive the scent of a pine that had grown on a world her family left generations ago. These were not always direct. At times, the filaments wove a collage of images that felt like a dream stitched from many warming moments. The experience had a tenderness to it that made the crew linger. In a way, the planet gave them gentle presents of things they had missed or had never known they wanted. There was a pattern to the generosity. The filaments responded most vividly to attention that was calm and slow. Instruments that approached with whirring motors and sharp pulses produced noise and reflexive prickles, but hands and voices that were patient found the filaments opening like flowers to light. The Astrians' engineers adjusted their approaches accordingly. Data-gathering methods became rituals rather than tests. Sena would place a palm near a filament and hum a simple human low note, and the filament would vibrate in a way that suggested recognition. They grew into rituals of exchange, a morning cataloging session, a midday recording, an evening of shared reflections. The rituals kept them safe not because they were enforced, but because they tethered attention to routine and human connection. The planet, if it had intentions at all, seemed to appreciate the steady cadence of human presence. Exposure left subtle prints. The crew found that their dreams softened. Where before they slept in fractured bursts, the hard, erratic sleeps of people who live by alarms and checklists, their nights lengthened into deeper folds. They dreamed of long walks and of hands that knew how to braid ropes, of small kitchens and the exact pattern of a neighbor's laugh. They began to share fragments over coffee, and each retelling made the memories feel more solid. Life aboard a ship is necessarily social in small ways. You make coffee for someone at 3 in the morning because their watch runs late. You keep a corner warm with a heater because the person on the next shift prefers the cool. these smallnesses became more meaningful on the pale horizon. The crew planted a tiny hydroponic corner beneath the observation deck with clumsy gratitude. They built it not as a research objective, but as a hearth, a place to tend something living and witness the small vegetal patience that mirrors the planet's own. No one converted to the world's will. People did not stop laughing or cease to read mission protocols. But there were changes as gentle as shoreline erosion. A pilot who once treated a shuttleman's approach like a ledger now smiled at the micro-curtains of light in the cockpit. A technician who used to speak in clipped terms began leaving paper notes, awkward and affectionate for his colleagues. These were the happy kinds of changes, the sort that mission summaries would later describe as increased crew cohesion and morale. Yet Dr. Javed's notes carried a steady sentence of caution. Long exposures to filtered recollection could reweave self-narrative. She cautioned rotations, time limits near the hollows, and careful logging of memory samples. We must remember that the mind is porous, and not all porosity is benign, she wrote in crisp lines. Nobody argued with the advice, they only stretched it into longer margins. Not everyone sought out the filaments. Some kept to the asterion, content to read instruments and observe from a distance. Others went down the hollows every day. There was a steady acceptance of difference in how each person engaged. Acceptance itself was part of the planet's lesson, if it had one, to let each creature meet it as they needed. The planet, too, seemed to wear acceptance like a garment. When the crew would bring a small offering, a preserved fruit, a recorded lullaby, the filaments would respond with a pattern of light and harmonic vibrato. When they offered nothing and simply lay down near the mouth of a tunnel to watch the slow play of light, the filaments rolled back into quiet. One particular evening stands clear in Navarre's later recollection. The sky held a double ribbon of aurora, the ship's engines sleeping quiet after a long data transfer. The crew drifted across the deck like the soft tide. Sina had a thermos of something warm and bitter. Louis had an old, weathered story to tell. The botanist, Mira, spoke in a whisper about a seed she'd managed to sprout. The talk went on without hurry. They traded small confidences and gentle shames. Outside, the planet seemed to hum in a way that suggested appreciation rather than hunger. It feels like being in a room where people are being considerate on purpose, Louis said, smiling. Not because they have to, but because they want to. The words landed like a small stone on a calm pond. Around them, small ripples of laughter and memory blurred into the long night. The pale horizon did not replace home. It offered the shape of longing in forms people could recognize. Memories returned with slightly different edges. A childhood kitchen with a new salt jar on the shelf. A neighbor with a different cadence to speech. These differences could have been disconcerting if they arrived at once, but the filaments presented them gradually, like pages turned slowly. When the mission's orbiting controllers sent up a request, a simple, bureaucratic ask for accelerated sample returns and stricter quarantine, the crew felt a tug in two directions. From Earth, the language was measured, a polite insistence. Document everything, limit exposure, return when ready. From Lyra 7, The planet's lullaby seemed to argue only for more presence. The result was not confrontation, but the stretching of allegiances in small increments. Navarre found himself composing replies that were both technically sound and emotionally compromised, with a quietness he found odd. "You're not obligated to stay," the transmission from Mission Control said. But the message also contained the factual implication that leaving meant closing a particular kind of door. The crew debated. They spoke in calm tones and wrote longer logs. They rotated watch schedules more strictly. And yet, as the days expanded into months, the temptation to remain near that slow, listening world grew like lichen on old stone, almost invisible and then unmistakably present. No dramatic choice was forced upon them. There was no dying scream or flashing red alarm. Instead, there were decisions of an intimate kind. Whether to go down into a hollow at dusk to listen, whether to move a chair closer to another crew member on the observation deck, whether to record everything and send it home or to keep some small things private. Aran, the shuttle pilot, began to spend long, solitary hours near a particular hollow whose filaments replied with a lullaby that braided images of afternoons spent under a cool roof. He returned from those visits calmer, his hands softer on controls, his docking approaches tender enough to feel almost ceremonial. There was a shy happiness about him that spread like a fragrance, easy to inhale and not hard to let go. People would sometimes talk about leaving the planet alone, giving it the space it seemed to deserve. Others would say that the very act of observing changed the object of observation, and that having a witness was sometimes a gift. The conversations were rarely heated. They moved like fingers down a well-tended list. Pros and cons, possible risks, contingencies. In private, some crew members also found themselves making small promises, vows to call a relative and read them a poem, a resolution to plant something upon their return. The world above them offered up solace, and solace had a way of refocusing attention on tender obligations. If there is any kind of sorrow in a calm story, it is usually the gentle passing of things that once were and now are not. On the pale horizon, loss arrived as the slow forgetting of precise details. A dream might come woven, and a week later the minute arrangement of a room would be fuzzy. They called it the soft erosion of edges. It was more like living near the sea. Things shift slowly and are not always replaced. One night, a technician left a small cargo container too close to a hollow. He returned in the morning to find the container's outlines slightly altered, as if the filaments had rearranged space around the object to make it fit better with some remembered habit. He laughed and made a small note, but the laugh had a little crack in it. Later, he described how he could not recall the exact pattern of the wallpaper in the house where he grew up, not wholly. The planet did not steal the big things, names, faces, essential facts, but the arrangement of details, the perfect curve of a vase, sometimes became softened. Dr. Javed organized discussions about this. The crew dried their eyes with practiced hands and took extra notes. They made physical mementos, cataloged their recordings, and sometimes wrote letters to themselves. The measures were modest but real, a way to keep memory from being liquefied entirely into the planet's slow balm. There was no dramatic loss of identity,
People remained themselves with the same likes and dislikes and professional rigor. Still, there was a sense that returning to another world would be like leaving a room where someone had rearranged the furniture. Everything would be there, but it would take a moment to find what you used to reach for automatically.
After several months, the mission planners sent a new instruction, a request to base a longer-term research node on the pale horizon with careful quarantine and the possibility of deeper study. The idea was not to colonize, but to learn deeply. For the crew of the Asterion, this directive translated into a question that felt older than bureaucracy. How much of a life should one spend listening? They called a slow meeting in the observation deck. The auroras were dim that evening, and the planet outside held its pale face like a patient listener. Each member of the crew spoke in measured ways. Points were made: scientific value, contamination risk, emotional cost. Concessions were offered. The conversation was, in itself, an exercise in the same patience the planet asked for. They were deciding not whether to flee in panic, nor whether to abandon caution for ecstasy, but whether to keep a presence that respected both the scientific method and the quietness the place inspired. In the end, their decision combined the two most human things they had left: curiosity and care. They proposed a model for intermittent residency, a small rotating station on the surface, strict decontamination, and an emphasis on personal well-being. It was conservative by mission standards and generous by the standards of space agencies who loved clear data above human nuance. Navarre drafted the reply with hands that did not tremble as much as he had thought they might. The letter was professional, long, and full of footnotes. It asked for resources, for time, and for patience. He did not write that the planet had taught them new ways to be gentle. That sentence felt too private for the mission paperwork. Years later, the Asterion's crew would scatter across the systems. Some returned to families with softened tempers and new rituals. An evening tea ritual passed down like a small lighthouse to hold the night. Others took positions in research centers where they taught colleagues how to hold observation like a prayer. A few stayed intermittently on Lyra 7, coming and going in scheduled increments to tend a small station that became a human patch on a much larger, listening world. They told stories of no violence because there was none to tell. The pale horizon did not demand souls, nor did it seduce them with exploitative cunning. It afforded a different test: whether people could spend long amounts of time in a place that simply reflected back warmth, and whether that reflection could change the way they cared for others. The story's stakes were not climactic. They were instead sustained: the slow building of routines, the deliberate turning toward one another, the careful remembering of details. In time, small cultural habits developed among those who returned from the pale horizon. A certain way to place a cup on a saucer, a habit of closing doors softly, a preference for low, patient music. Children of people who had visited the planet sometimes dreamed of landscapes they had never seen and woke with a hunger for small, steady attention. The influence spread quietly, like the long echo of a song. The pale horizon remained a planet that would outlive them and their descendants, and the last mechanical watch the Asterion would ever wind. It kept its filaments and crystal veins and its particular lullaby, indifferent to whether anyone listened. Yet what matters in the human way of the world is not the scale of the cosmos, but the shape of what people choose to do with what is given. The crew learned to obey two rules: slow down and keep one another close. They learned that some places ask only to be witnessed,
and that witnessing, done with care, can be a kind of love. If you were to stand on the observation deck of a ship like the Asterion on any of those long nights, you would hear simple things: valves that sighed, coffee pouring into a thermos, the murmur of conversation like a small tide. Outside, the planet would hum a slow pair of notes, not quite music, not quite silence, and the world would feel held. That is perhaps enough to be called peace.
The station hung in the deep like a speck of salt in a wide bowl. It had been built not for war nor for mining, but for keeping, a vault to protect seeds, cuttings, small things that remembered how to become green. They called it the Meridian Nursery, and its orbit bridged two small worlds whose names were used in logistics cables and rarely in poems. People sent supplies and research teams to it, and sometimes a passing trader would lower a rope ladder and exchange stories for a jar of honey grown from the hydroponics bay. At the center of the station lived Nara Sethi. She was the keeper, a title that had grown out of habit more than ceremony, and her work was both practical and devotional. Her days were full of calendars and routines, nutrient mixes measured to the milliliter, light cycles tuned to a playlist of sun simulations, humidity mapped across the showers of mist like a topographical chart. But the deepest part of her life there was quieter than any duty sheet. She kept track of time by the slow arc of a seedling's first leaf, by the way roots learned to memorize the path of water. Nara's quarters looked over the inner ring where the garden spread, terraces of muted green and pale blooms that responded to the station's careful rhythms. Lights moved through the glass in the morning to mimic the tilt of a world that was not the station's own. At night, which aboard a rotating habitat meant the dimming of artificial suns and the curling of warm lamps, she would sit by a small window and press a palm to the glass, feeling the soft hum of life beyond. The harp of air recyclers, the tiny motor that spun the moisture filter, and the deliberate hiss of the nutrient drip, everything made a steady music she had learned to follow. Years earlier, Nara had been an agricultural engineer who designed irrigation for coastal greenhouses. She had left planets because planets raised other obligations, families and debts, and the weather of human relationships, and because the Meridian had offered the quiet she needed to think like a seed. She liked the station for its rhythms. There was a kind of kindness in the predictability of pumps and the slow accumulation of compost. It let her watch lives begin in small, dignified ways. Her companion on the station was not another person, but a small, old robot called Rua. Rua had been built for line-level maintenance and had a voice that sounded like the first note of a bell when it spoke. It was small enough to be picked up and heavy enough to be trusted. Rua swept the corridors, tightened bolts, and cataloged pH levels with a mechanical thoroughness that made Nara laugh every time it recited numbers like a poem.
Phosphate at 0.22, Rua would say, and then, after a pause, and the basal root shows a curious propensity toward light of 3000 Kelvin. Nara would smile. Curious to whom? She would ask, and Rua would swivel its sensor and beep in a way that implied it had a provisional opinion. The life of the Meridian was filled with small kindnesses that looked like chores. Every morning, Nara walked the terraces. She checked the young shoots, pinched away a tender rogue leaf, measured a stem's angle, and sometimes, when the day felt like the softest kind of mercy, she read aloud to the seedlings. She read not because they needed stories, but because the human voice uncoiled the hours into something warmer. She read aloud the letters of travelers who had once tasted the station's honey. She read recipes and small childhood jokes, and on particularly lonely afternoons, handwritten notes sent from people who had once looked after a garden and missed the weight of soil in their hands. Sometimes visitors came, horticulturalists on sabbatical, a retired botanist who had memorized the rain patterns of a world Nara had never seen, a child from a far colony who wanted to plant a seed because someone had told them of a woman who kept green in the dark. The station welcomed them with the same modest dignity it offered everything: a place at a workbench, a loaner pair of gloves, a slice of fruit, and a thermos of tea. The visitors would learn the rituals, how to coax roots into new channels, how not to over-brighten a young stem, and then depart with small parcels of cuttings and a map of the meridian's terraces folded in their pocket. There were quiet economies in those visits. A botanist might trade a vial of new microalgae for a batch of teas. A teacher might conduct a short workshop on compost turbines and leave behind a song the children had made. The meridian gathered more than plant life. It gathered stories and the slow accumulation of human taste. Outside, the stars were indifferent and precise. The station's viewports framed them like pictures, a wide scatter of light, cold as a tarnished mirror. On certain nights, the orbit swept the station between the two worlds the meridians served, and their combined faint glow painted the terraces in a color Nara liked to call washed linen. Those nights were for patience and mending. Nara would lay out torn work gloves and sew them with tape and thread, humming the way one hums in a church where the worship is the endurance of small things. Rua would place a basin of warm water nearby and hand her a small, coarse sponge. The rituals made the station feel less like a machine and more like a home that had learned how to be careful. Such care yielded surprising tiny miracles. Once, after a long region of dry maintenance cycles and slow experimental failures, a patch of unexpected seedlings erupted in the corner of a terrace. The plants were neither the varieties they had planted, nor ones the logs recognized. They had the wrong phyllotaxy in the leaves, a surprising spiral count, and a scent like rain on a stone. Nara had no idea where they came from. She and Rua checked the seed vaults and the compost runs and the packs from the last few visitors. Nothing matched.
They watched the patch like thieves watching a sunrise. Over 10 days, the seedlings grew into a small stand that shaded a little knoll, a place where the air felt cooler and the light seemed to linger longer. People who visited the meridian afterward would say the stand had a particular hush that made them think of being held. Children liked to lie there with a book and an adult's hand on their shoulder, losing minutes they never wanted back. Nara suspected that sometimes life found a way to arrange surprise just to remind itself how to be surprising. The station was not immune to problems. Pumps failed, microfilaria fouled filters. The minor bureaucracy of supply chains gnashed its teeth when shipments were late. Once, the nutrient infusion pump failed mid-cycle and a row of half-grown lettuces folded politely into stasis. Nara and Rua worked through one long night to rebuild the pump from spare parts and the skeleton of an old coffee machine. By dawn, they had coaxed the plants back to life. The lettuces shivered awake like people who had slept with a good blanket pulled up. Rua announced, with a tone that tried to manage pride, "Plants show a recovery index of 70%. Emotional index of keeper raised significantly." "Don't make me blush, robot," Nara said.
She knew better than to pretend the work was only technique. There was always more than skill in gardening. There was a relationship you cultivated with patience and a willingness to feel the small failures. On a particular winter cycle, which meant thicker lamp hours and a stricter condensation schedule, a slow-bound freighter named the Orilla drifted in for a short refueling and a swap of supplies. Its captain, an older woman with hair the color of old paper, disembarked with a lopsided grin. She had traveled many routes and had stories in her pockets like spare rope. They shared a meal in the communal kitchen, a stew thick with root flour and a soft bread that Nara had baked with the wild yeast they'd cultured from the station's air. The food tasted like everything the Meridian was about: modest, patient, made from small things gathered over long attention. "You keep something right here that a lot of people forget," the captain said, nodding toward the terraces. "You keep the idea that small things need small, steady love. That's rarer than people let on."
Nara drank her tea and listened. She thought of the Orilla's captain as a kind of weather passing through to remind them of the wider roots. Rua produced a small tin of dried citrus peels as a gift, cataloged them ceremoniously, and asked, "Shall I log the captain's humidity?" The captain laughed, and the three of them, keeper, robot, wanderer, sat in a room lit by low lamps and kept time like a small coastal town waiting for tide. At night, in the quiet hours, Nara would sometimes place a hand on a plant's pot and whisper small promises. It was strange, the way humans made vows to things that might not perceive them. She promised to keep the water gentle, to not cut too close, to read aloud a poem every Friday. The promises were small law. They gave form to the days. People asked her once, when she had been keeper for 5 years, whether she ever felt lonely. She thought of all the visitors, the passing freighters, the communal work hours. She thought of Rua, precise and companionable in its own way. She thought of the seeds in the vault, each a compressed story. "Sometimes," she said, "but loneliness and solitude are different. I like the kind of solitude that makes room for other people's voices." When the station's communications relay chimed with a message from a far colony that had been waiting for an update, Nara would compose a reply like a letter to a friend. She would measure the language carefully. The community in the colony liked to know the station's pulse, which seedlings had thrived, which experiments had been promising, which recipes had become popular. They liked to receive small parcels of sweets baked from Meridian flour. The exchange kept them alive with each other's smallnesses. Once, a child from the colony sent a drawing of what they imagined the Meridian to be, a tall tree that reached through a ring of stars, leaves that were tiny houses, roots that wrote letters in the soil. Nara kept the drawing folded in the inside pocket of her jacket. When she looked at it, she would find the station feeling both bigger and more gentle. There were rituals for maintenance, of course, the weekly filter changes, the quarterly nutrient cycles, the annual inventory of the seed vault, where each packet was opened and its viability was checked. But the rituals that mattered most were the impromptu ones: a hand offered when a fragile stem needed support, a pot brought back to a visitor who had left it by mistake, a lullaby hummed low in the hydroponic bay to a plant that seemed restless. The Meridian had no quarrels of empire, no wars to keep watch against. Its politics were small and domestic: how to share water when a shipment was late, who would teach the next rotating intern how to prune correctly, whether to keep a certain terrace devoted to experimental pollination by robotic bees. Decisions were made with the slow empathy of people who understood scarcity and abundance in equal measure. On a day when the orbit brought the station between the two worlds, and the light outside was the pale color of milk glass,
A storm of micrometeorite dust grazed the outer ring. It was not catastrophic, but it scraped a long line of the outer shielding and left a dusting on viewports. Rua registered a minor delta in particulate count, and Nara spent an afternoon with a little brush, sweeping each viewport clean in long, patient gestures. As she worked, she hummed the same song she used to sing to keep herself awake on late nights. 3 notes in a minor key, slow as stepping stones. When she finished, she sat down on a low bench and watched the terraces breathe. The plants were quiet in the washed light, and she felt, as she always felt at moments like this, a tenderness toward the smallness of their lives. She imagined them claiming a place on a world one day, their roots remembering the meridian like the way an old person remembers a childhood room. Visitors sometimes asked what she would miss if she ever left the station. She didn't like to think of leaving. The thought felt like a cracked cup, fragile and possible. "I'll miss the timing," she said once. "I'll miss the way the basil leans when I bring it a little closer to the lamp. I'll miss Rua's way of announcing numbers like a chant." Years folded on like the rings of a tree. People came and went. Interns learned and left. The seed vault gained packets and sometimes lost them to experiments that failed. The station changed in tiny ways. A new variety of microgreen that required a softer mist. A set of tiles replaced with a friendlier tread pattern for agricultural robots. The station was mutable in marginal ways and constant in its core. Towards the end of a particular cycle, one that marked the 10th anniversary of Nara's stewardship, the station received a visitor who would change the meridian in a small but enduring way. A young musicologist named Eli, who sat the intersection of rhythm and plant growth. Eli was invited as part of an exchange program and brought with him instruments that looked more like sculpture than tools, a small harp made of polymer and a set of chimes that reacted to light. He proposed an experiment to see whether patterned sounds, composed to follow the station's light cycles, would affect germination rates and root bias. Nara agreed. She loved experiments that felt like conversations. They worked together for months, composing sequences of low tones and gentle pulses, testing variations and charting results. To their surprise, certain patterns nudged roots to grow in thinner spirals, while other cadences encouraged broader leaf expansion. It wasn't a magic solution to hunger or drought, but it made the plants tend towards subtle architectures that had their own kind of beauty. The experiment yielded an unexpected byproduct, a soundtrack that the meridian would play at the end of each day, a blanket of gentle harmonics that made the terraces feel like a cathedral warmed by a kind domestic sun. People who visited said they slept better after listening to it. Volunteers who worked on the late shift found it slowed their hands in ways that made them gentler. The music didn't make the station into anything other than a station, but it made the station feel more like a place to rest one's hands in. Time, which moves relentlessly in the day-to-day, gathers differently in a life made of small rituals and communal care. Nara grew older, not dramatically, but in fine lines around her eyes and a hair or two of silver at her temple. Rua's casing rubbed thin in places it had brushed often, and sometimes it misremembered a code sequence and then corrected itself with a polite little apology beep. The meridian remained patient and steady. On the morning of the 10th anniversary, the crew organized a small celebration. The cake was a modest thing, a dense loaf made with root flour and candied citrus from the era when the Orilla's captain had passed through. And the guests were the usual mix: a freighter captain, an intern who had stayed a decade and grown a family, a botanist who had returned from the field, a retired teacher who came to the station every year to lecture children about soil. They brought small gifts:
a folded chart of ancient rain patterns, a recorded lullaby from a colony across the ring, a tin of honey from the station's most productive season. They set Rui, an obsolete maintenance drone, upgraded into a music stand at the center of the terrace and play the soundtrack Eli had composed. The harmonics unfurled across the terraces like a blanket. People stood with cups in their hands and watched the seedlings move minutely in the sound. Nara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamps and everything to do with the company. Rua, in its careful manner, recited the station's metrics, not as a clinician, but like a friend giving the numbers of the things they'd loved. After the small ceremony, as the guests filtered out and the station returned to its usual hush, Nara walked alone along the longest terrace. She touched leaf tips, whispered small thanks for the season's survival, and felt the old familiar ache of gratitude. She thought, briefly, about leaving. It was not a resolve, but an acknowledgement, one of those soft ideas that fit the shape of things. She would eventually have to make choices, perhaps teach someplace warm, perhaps travel on a freighter like the Orilla for a few circuits, perhaps tend a windowed garden in a city where people watched the sky and forgot it. The thought of leaving did not sting. It folded into the continuing present like a draft in the corner of a room you love.
She reached the end of the terrace and sat on a low bench. Rua rolled close, and for a moment the two of them, keeper and robot, watched the dimming of the station's artificial sun and the slow opening of the evening chimes. Outside the viewport, the two worlds they bridged swung into alignment and painted the terraces in an old, soft blue. "Do you remember?" Rua asked in its bell-like voice. "The seed packet from the child? The one with the drawing?" Nara smiled. "Yes," she said. "It's folded in my jacket." "Shall we plant something from it next cycle?" Rua asked. They both knew they would. Planting was never a single act. It was a vow that extended beyond the visible season, a trust in time and quiet care. Nara stood, brushed soil from her palms with a careful touch no one had taught her, and together, the keeper and the little maintenance robot walked back to the seed vault, where the child's packet waited in a drawer labeled with a faded sticker. They opened the packet and read the tiny seeds within as if reading a small, hopeful letter. Outside, the stars kept toward their indifferent journeys. Inside, the meridian hummed its gentle music, and Nara's hands moved like a practiced blessing. The world, the wide, unknowable dark around them, continued its patient arc. The station, small as it was, kept a kind of watch that mattered only insofar as people still needed places to learn how to be patient and how to hold one another's small things safe. That, Nara thought, as she planted the first of the child's seeds, was a good enough purpose. To tend, to remember, to offer a slow and steady place where life could come to its senses and sleep into being. When the first green ribbon pulled through the soil days later, Nara sat with Rua and hummed a tune she had learned in childhood. 3 notes and a pause. The plants listened with the mute but faithful attention of living things, and Nara felt the station's long, slow kindness fold back around them, quiet as a hand on a shoulder. And so, the meridian kept being a garden between stars, neither grand nor small in any final sense, but simply what it had chosen to be, a place for beginnings, tended with the long patience that makes small miracles slowly, gently, over time.
The night the stars seemed to breathe, Lyra woke to the soft hum of the ship and the remembered shape of the sky. It was a gentle kind of waking, the kind that arrives without the sharp edge of alarm or the heavy weight of unresolved thought, as if the universe itself had reached out with a carefully cupped hand and set her back into herself. Outside the observation dome, the sea of tranquility glinted like a pale memory. Beyond it, the rim of earth hung thin and luminous, a blue wound of light stitching the dark. Lyra pressed her forehead to the glass and let her breath fog a small circle. The fog cleared. The stars remained. "You're awake," came a voice, low and amused. Moloch, already sitting at the console with a steaming cup suspended in a field of microgravity. He loved the ritual of hot liquids in cold places. Lyra smiled. "Always at nights like this." He floated closer, offering the cup. The ceramic was warm against her palm. For a while they only watched in companionable silence, two shapes framed by the dome, small and steady against the infinite. The ship, a modest exploration vessel named Hearthlight, had no grand engines, no weaponry, and only a thin shield of redundancy around the life systems. It was built for journeys that were patient walks, not bursts of glory. Their mission was quiet too, to trace pathways between the places humanity had discovered and to listen. They had no need of hurry. In sleep tales and lullabies, the universe tended to be painted as indifferent, an endless theater of cold. But for Lyra, calmness was what the sky offered when you leaned close and listened. Each orbit, each quiet pass felt like the universe exhaling after a long conversation. "We will pass Mars at dawn," Moloch said. His tone was practical, the trained voice of someone who kept logs. "Valles Marineris will slide by like a shadow." Lyra nodded. Images of the Great Canyon carved by whatever small catastrophes and patient slow wars of erosion had shaped it swam behind her eyelids. She thought of the ancient rivers that might have once moved through the planet like thoughts moving through sleep. She thought of the ancient rivers that might have once moved through the planet like thoughts moving through sleep. She thought of the ancient rivers that might have once moved through the planet like thoughts moving through sleep. "Tell me a story," she said softly, "of somewhere we visited." Moloch's smile was quick, conspiratorial. "Choose." Lyra let her hand drift across the cup, felt the gentle thermal gradient underneath her fingers. "Europa," she said, "but make it gentle." He laughed, and the sound was a small, warm bell. "Europa, then." The moon itself is a place of small miracles. It does not shout, it keeps. When they drew near Europa, the great white sheet of ice shone against the dark ocean like a promise. The first time Lyra had seen its plumes from a distance, she had remembered the first rains of childhood, those early moments when the world seemed to open and reveal what it had been hiding. On Europa, the plumes were small and sudden, like the breath of a sleeping giant. They rose brief as prayer and fell again into the night. Lyra and Moloch descended to a ship's tether in a field that smelled faintly of ozone and cold iron. The soft thud of boots on the shell of Europa felt like a poem read aloud. Their suits hummed, their lungs listened to the rhythm of filtered air. Beneath the ice, the ocean moved in slow, patient currents, and their instruments recorded songs. The rubbing of ice plates, the muted movement of warm water kissing cold. They found a shore that night, not of sand, but of frost and scalloped ice, where the horizon glowed with a dim internal light. Lyra sat down and let the hush gather around her like a shawl. In the distance, a spray lifted, and she could almost imagine islands of steam and glass. She thought of the fragile edges where water met ice and felt the same tenderness she felt when memory met reality. "Do you ever wonder what it's like to be the place itself?" she asked Malik. He made a face at first, then grew thoughtful. "All the time. The planet is older than our names. It can keep each moment without owning it. That's a comfort." Lyra considered that. If a world could be patient, what might it teach? She imagined Europa, whole and slow, remembering meteor strikes and the long gleam of stars, the coming and going of comets like distant travelers who insist only on passing through. They left a small transponder on the shore. It sang a soft electronic lullaby every hour, a little beacon that said, in a tone only machines and the very curious might understand, "We were here. You are not alone." That night, back on Hearthlight, Lyra traced the map of Europa with her finger, as if following the ribs of a sleeping animal. The ship rested, and from the dome she watched plumes lift and fall like breath.
"Humanoid," she whispered, and Malik caught the word. "Aye," he said, "we are all wearing flesh we borrowed, but the places, they have their own way of being." She liked the idea. It made the universe less empty. It turned the cold into a kind of patient friend. On Titan, the skies poured a very different kind of night. Titan was thick with orange haze, the atmosphere a gentle barrier that muffled sound and softened edges. Lakes of hydrocarbons lay like black mirrors below them, reflecting twilight that seemed to go on and on. Lyra remembered the first time walking that surface felt like learning to slow a new rhythm into her body. The footfalls were heavy and sure, the air outside the suit pressing in like a remembered coat. There was a small settlement where humans and human-built mines had left instruments and weather habitats. At dusk, the methane fog turned the horizon into a slow, living theater. Lyra loved to sit by the lakes and let the silence work its way inward. On Titan, even the stars felt as if they were breathing through a long, thick veil. They met a wayfarer there once, a thin, stoic robot sent decades ago to learn the tides and the winds and to keep track of storms. It had no need for conversation, but its memory banks hummed with a million notes. Malik had found an old child's toy lodged in a hollow near the shore. A small sphere, faded but intact, as if someone had once rolled it in a language that could be read by touch. "Do you think we would ever leave something like that behind?" Lyra asked the robot, jokingly polite. The robot turned its optical array at them and, in a way that felt uncannily like thought, showed them a recording of the first human boots touching the surface, the launch tears and the quiet prayers told between breaths. "Humanoids make small artifacts," Malik said later, holding the toy to the light. "We leave traces because we are mortal in a way the ground is not." Lyra liked this too. Humanity's small things were not minor. They were how people said to the universe,
I noticed. Remember me kindly."
They took the toy with them when they left. On colder nights, Lyra kept it balanced on her forearm, where she could feel its roundness and its history. It reminded her of laughter at the edge of storms. Sometimes they would visit places not in the solar neighborhood, but in the darker shelves of the map. Kepler's many small signals, the TRAPPIST-1 system with its string of near siblings, Proxima b with its quiet, stubborn orbit. The details of these planets were still promises more than certainties, mapped by telescopes and modeled by careful minds. But in the hush of night, they felt as real as the hands that folded the blankets on the ship. At Kepler 186f, for instance, the field readings suggested a temperate world with oceans and continents and seasons. Lyra fashioned stories for herself there, an ocean that held its own slow music, grasses that bent like people in prayer, a sky that rippled with storms that made the air smell of iron and new rain. She would close her eyes and walk along imagined beaches where mineral sands sang underfoot. TRAPPIST-1 had a chorus, many small stones arranged around a home star, each one a different key on the same instrument. The idea of neighbors all so close filled Lyra with a tender ache. She pictured them as a village of planets, leaning in to whisper across the electromagnetic night. Proxima b, stubborn in its orbit around the faintest star nearest to their own, was like a distant friend you kept meaning to visit. It had been discovered because someone had noticed tiny, patient wobbles in a star. That was the kind of discovery Lyra loved, a slow hand on a shoulder, a subtle hint that another body existed and had a story to tell. Even without the certainty of oceans or skies, Proxima b felt intimate because of the attentiveness that had announced it. "Why do you think we need to visit them?" Malik asked once as they drifted through mapped constellations with nothing but quiet between them. "Because noticing is a way of saying we belong to the same story. Not to end it, but to keep it honest," Lyra answered. And so they flew, on a path that gathered places like shells. Some nights they would play old songs through the ship's speakers at a low level, impossibly old human songs, lullabies brought along for reasons that had less to do with utility and more to do with warmth. Music was an amateur anthropologist of feeling. It could shape a room into a harbor.
There were other nights when the ship floated beyond the bright reach of familiar charts, and they let the dome view simply hold the stars while they slept. The quiet in those hours was not simply the absence of sound, it was an active presence. It gave Lyra room to think of small futures and old ones at once. She dreamed sometimes, and dreams were honest things for her, of a place called Harbor Point. Harbor Point did not exist on any map. It lived in the soft part of her memory, a house on the edge of a sea where nights were slow and long and people passed cups with no need for hurry. In the dream, the windows were round like portholes, and the furniture sagged with kindness. A cat, impossibly patient and wise, would wind itself around her ankles and remind her to breathe. In the wet, functional world of instruments and duty, dreaming felt like a glint of private weather. It reminded her that everything she saw, the plains on Mars that might be old riverbeds, the deep, dark plumes of Enceladus, the ringed whispers of Saturn, could be held tenderly like a saved sentence. There was one night, between a visit to a faint exoplanet and a sweep past an old comet,
when they came upon a field of debris. Not dangerous, only an architecture of ancient fragments from a long-dead sled of a probe or the skeleton of a comet taken apart by time. It floated like litter in slow rotation. The pieces were small and brilliantly harmless, catching the star like teeth. Malik let the ship drift, and they turned the external lights down so only the natural silver of the fragments could speak. Lyra imagined each shard had its own memory, a tiny solar panel remembering a last spark, a bent antenna recalling a last message it had sent into the dark. The thought made her feel as if they were not alone in their smallness. "We should pick one up," Malik murmured. He reached into a small locker and produced a delicate claw device designed for such salvaging. Together, they softened the ship's approach and let the claw take the tiniest, most unremarkable shard, a strip of alloy etched with characters nearly worn to oblivion. It was beautiful because it had a past and no more use. In the ship's laboratory, they held it under magnification and read with the slow affection of archivists the printed letters. A fragment of a name, a serial number, nothing glamorous. It was, unromantically, a piece of an older human attempt to know. "We keep it," Lyra said, "to remember things are made by hands that tremble and hope."
They placed the shard in a small wooden box Malik kept under his bunk. The wood was not needed. It was a gesture. When you are small beneath the sky, gestures matter as a way of being human. If the universe has a language, it is patient. If the universe has a comfort, it is the slow persistence of things. On a cold night near Saturn, where the rings laid themselves like 1,000 tiny mirrors around their star, the ship's dome framed a scene that made Lyra's breath slow. They had tethered the hearthlight to a research buoy, once used by ring scientists. The buoy now drifted, a bobbing memory, and from it the rings spilled like the slow flow of 1,000 glass beads. Light traveled along those beads and fell into the dark with the softness of a prayer. They released 2 small gliders and watched them sail between ring particles, their tiny cameras feeding back artful, unhurried images. In the dimness, the gliders appeared almost alive, obedient to the minimal currents, touched by the same patient physics that had shaped the rings. Nothing in their motion suggested urgency. Even the collisions among ring particles, if such things could be called collisions, were like the gentle shuffling of dancers who knew their steps. "We're so small," Lyra said. Malik glanced at her, a question in his expression. "Yes, but look how the smallness becomes an act of presence. It matters." She was thinking about the fishermen who, on old blue and green maps, would chart the sea and write notes. "Good harbor, fair winds, stay a while." The universe, wide as it was, took in catalogs and small marks. It did not scoff. It accommodated. That night, they spoke in low voices about people they had loved and left. They named them gently, like calling birds. Some they kept in memory as whole people. Her friend Nari with her laugh like a bell. Malik's first mentor with a voice like old wood. Others they would hold as fragments, a smell, a phrase, a glance. The ship listened, and out beyond the dome, the rings glowed and did not judge. On the long travels, there was one place Lyra returned to again and again in memory. A small valley on Mars, where the wind had once cut ridges into ochre rock, and where the remnants of a human research shelter rested like shells on a beach. They had landed there at the end of summer, when the thin Martian air was warm enough to loosen dust that had deep memory of storms. The shelter had been abandoned in an era of careful withdrawal. Its panels were pitted. Its journal terminals still hummed faintly with cached poems and log entries. Lyra loved to pry the terminal open and read the small things left behind. A coffee stain on a report, a poem written by someone who had not known they were writing for the future, a doodle of a comet. On that valley afternoon, a child, a real child, not theirs, but someone they met on an orbital transfer, had stepped into the shelter and regarded the view. The child was small, with bare hair like a halo, and her eyes were vast with simple wonder. "Why do you keep this place?" the child asked, kicking at a loose pebble. Lyra knelt and put her hand on the pebble. "Because we like to remember people who tried," she said. The child thought for a moment and then smiled with the seal of a person who knew something important without naming it. "Then we should keep it tidy." They had left the shelter cleaner than they had found it. They had swept away dust that wanted to hide the floorboards and left a small pencil drawing on the table, a comet with a tail like wool. They told the child they would come back, and while they could not promise when, a promise like that did not have to be exact to be true. Lyra sometimes wondered if leaving was a way of promising to return. It might be a poor promise, they might never return, but the intention mattered as a salt to preserve memory. The ship had a small garden. It was not a garden so much as an arrangement of living things in a shallow, confined space. A colony of mosses that thrived in low light, a set of hydroponic greens, a pot with a single stubborn basil plant. The plant had been Moloch's idea, a joke at first, then insistence. They tended it like two people in love keep a quiet secret. At night, Lyra would sometimes sit with the basil between her knees and breathe in the green smell. The plant took their carbon and gave back small oxygen, and its presence made the ship feel less like a metal cave and more like a small home with a friendly living center. On nights when the cosmos felt too vast, the basil reminded them of both fragility and resilience. It thrived on oddly small attentions, a scraped nail against soil, a whispered promise, a measured ration of water.
"Why keep plants?" a crewman once asked. "We have machines that can make air." Lyra thought of fingers and of the particular cadence of human care. Plants ask for us in a way that is a kindness. They require steadiness, and they return a quietness. They anchor you. Anchor. The word sat in the air like a buoy. Lyra liked the idea of being anchored by something smaller than yourself. It taught you to do small things slowly.
Then there was the night they listened to a star sing. It was not literal in the way one might expect. No audible voice rode the vacuum, but high-energy telescopes caught a pattern in a star's light, its flicker, and a computer translated that flicker into a slow wave that felt like a song. Lyra and Moloch turned all their instruments toward the star and let the wave move across the dome, rescaling its pulses into a frequency that could be appreciated as music. The song was simple, a lullaby of electromagnetic sighs, rising and falling with the steady patience of a heartbeat. It made them feel small in the right way, not erased, but included as listeners in a cathedral whose walls were made of light. The notes did not demand comprehension. They offered instead the permission to be quiet and to listen. Maybe all stars are singing, Moloch said. Maybe they are talking to one another like old friends, Lyra replied. They sat under that song until sleep took them like a tide. The stars' music recorded itself into their logs with an anxious human annotation, beautiful. The universe kept singing, indifferent and generous at once. Years later, when Lyra told stories to children in the orbital settlements, stories about the places she had been and about quiet things that mattered, the children would always ask for the one where the ship almost turned away from a light in the dark. It had happened near the edge of mapped space. A faint glimmer had appeared on long-range scanners. Not a star, not an asteroid, but a small, warm flash like the reflection from a cup. They had gone to look out of a mix of caution and curiosity. The flash was a stranded probe, its solar panels battered, but its internal clock still beating. It had been launched before Lyra was born by people who had believed in a kind of kindness that was as small as sending out a message and as large as trusting it might be heard.
The probe had data, not of a planet, but of letters. Messages sent by people who had been young and fearful and brave and unsure. The probe had been an attempt to keep a stream of human voices alive across time. It had a recorded lullaby, a fragment of a song from an old radio, and a list of names, and a phrase repeated like a necklace of words: keep the light. They towed it back to Hearthlight and restored what life they could to its circuitry. It sang the fragile lullaby again, and Lyra felt something in her chest that was like home. She realized then that tending to small failures was the same as tending to each other. The lost and the found were part of the same human gesture. When they returned the probe's records to the archive, people who were older than the probe cried at the sound of their names spoken back in a voice that had been sleeping in the dark. On good nights, and the ship encouraged many good nights, Lyra wrote letters she might never send. She wrote to Nari with the quiet details of small things, the brightness of Europa's plumes, the scent of Titan's lakes, the way morning on Mars felt like new bread. She wrote nothing important in the sense of policy or discovery. She wrote the kinds of notes that are meant to be read like talismans. Once she wrote, "The stars are patient, but they do not hurry. They teach me to breathe slowly." She tucked the letters into a small waterproof envelope and placed them in the waiting drawer beside Moloch's wooden box. They were not for him, strictly, but she liked the thought of a place holding fragments.
Spaces hold memory by design. There was a final small ritual they did before sleep. They would turn the ship's external audio field to a whisper and let a single historical speech play, someone's call for caring in a time that had been violent and brave. The old voice spoke of steadiness and of the value of small acts. It was rarely heard by anyone else, and yet the warmth of the old recording filled the cabins the way a hearth warms stone. "Humanoid," said Malik to Lyra one late night, fusing the word into a constant hum. "We're always revising what it means." Lyra smiled. "And that is the point."
On the night the stars seemed to breathe, the one she woke from gently at the ship's dome, Lyra closed her eyes and let the universe unfold like a long, slow story. She imagined Europa's ice as a friendly geologic hand, Titan's lakes as slow mirrors, Mars as an old diary with torn pages and coffee stains. She thought of Kepler's small hints and Trappist's close-knit planets and Proxima's stubborn orbit. She thought of the shard of alloy, of the little toy from Titan, of the probe that had kept names, and of the basil plant that refused to give up in the thin artificial gravity. Around her, the ship breathed. The instruments hummed. The dome made the stars feel like tiny punctuation marks in a sentence that went on for a very long time. She slept, finally, with the basil's scent in her dreams and the echo of a star song in her bones. In sleep, she walked the valley on Mars and left her own small drawing of a comet on a table. She tucked a tiny pebble under the pillow of Harbor Point and told the cat in her dream to stay. When the ship's alarm, soft and courteous, called them at dawn, neither Lyra nor Malik was surprised to wake on the right side of the world. They moved through the morning with a slow, deliberate tenderness that had been given to them by the sky. In the lab, the alloy shard gleamed in the soft light. On the table lay the little toy from Titan, warm from the ship's internal heating. "You realize," Malik said over his shoulder as they prepared to leave orbit, "we collect stories the way other folks collect shells." Lyra looked up at the dome. A faint aurora washed along the planet behind them, the light of charged particles meeting an atmosphere that welcomed them. "Yes," she said, "and we keep them because it is how we say we were here and how we say we cared." Hearthlight nudged itself forward, and the stars spread like a slow audience as they rose. The sea of tranquility shrank beneath them, and Earth hung like a blue memory stitched by hands that had once also been small and brave. Somewhere, a star breathed again, and they listened. The night, in its endless generosity, kept its pace. The planets turned. The tiny ship threaded the dark. Lyra closed her eyes in the light of unhurried constellations and let sleep arrive like an invited guest, patient, kindly, and sure.
They called it Harbor because the original surveyors, with their romantic maps and starboard bravado, had imagined the place as a refuge, a crescent of sheltered caverns where a ship might tuck in from the cosmic crosswinds and refuel on ice and silence. In the end, the name carried only half of what the first human eyes saw on approach, a ring of obsidian cliffs and a shallow basin that swallowed light. The other half, the one nobody put in any brochure, was the thing inside the ring, an aperture of impossible depth,
as if some titan had bored a pupil through the crust of the world and kept watching. Captain Mara Voss learned to distrust maps. By the time the Ariadne dropped out of transit and the basalt of Harbor's exosphere grew into jagged teeth on the screen, Mara's face had the same flat expression she used for bad contracts and worse weather. Her crew were used to living on the line between curiosity and catastrophe. That was why the company placed them on missions meant to pry at seams where the universe refused to be polite. "Altitude steady," murmured Jiro, the pilot, eyes flicking between displays. He had a permanent grease smudge on his ear from some engineering prayer he never finished. "L1 now. Sensors show nothing but..." He cleared his throat. "Anomalous reflectivity." Mara glanced at the main viewer. The crater, if it could be called that, didn't reflect anything the way a normal geological basin would. Waves of black shimmered across the surface like oil on water, but even as Jiro's instruments tried to reconcile photons they couldn't quite translate, the shimmering didn't act like light. It looked like memory. "We'll go in slow," she said. "Keep the external scanners on short cycles. No long-range scans until we have a perimeter." "Perimeter is 5 clicks of jagged rock," said Nara, without looking up from her tablet. Her voice had that irreverent calm that comes from years of standing inside gamma storms and still finding a way to make notes. "But the readings are..." She laughed softly, a short, nervous sound. "It's like the ground itself is... listening." "Listening?" Jiro repeated. "Not anthropomorphic," Nara snapped, then sighed. "Poor phrase. There are low-frequency oscillations in the electromagnetic field, and the structural infrasound matches patterns we've seen only in tectonic fatigue, except there's no heat signature. It's as if stress is forming without stressors." Mara felt that old itch behind her eyes, a mixture of hunger and caution. Curiosity could drown a ship faster than a hole in the hull. She flipped the comm to internal and addressed external. "This is Captain Voss of the Ariadne. Observation team preparing to disembark at Perimeter 6. Keep radio chatter minimal. Proximity lights on. Nara, your lead." The landing ramp hissed open like a mouth unhinging. The air tasted of recycled metal and static. Outside, the sky was a thick bruise of violet. Harbor's atmosphere fractured light into colors that didn't exist on charts. The crew stepped down in cold suits, helmets sealed, footsteps small on ground that refused to produce sound. Every soft crunch they expected became a vacuum whisper. Even sound here seemed to be a thing to be negotiated. They advanced through a corridor of spire rock, fingers brushing micro-etchings that bore no obvious pattern. Nara recorded everything with obsessive tenderness. "These marks are not natural. They repeat with geometric variants. Could be water erosion, but there's no sign of fluid channels. We might be looking at some kind of fossilized mechanism."
"Mechanism for what?" asked Leo, the geotechnician, always eager to find something to fix. Nara turned to him, eyes bright. "We don't know." Out past the spires, the ground opened into the basin. Harbor's throat. The crater's lip was lower here, as if the world had decided to slouch and let the sky slide into its lap. Looking down felt like staring into a hole where a dream had been ripped out. The aperture yawned wide and dark. Instruments read nothing beyond a few meters. LiDAR returned blank. Sound sensors bled into static. Jiro moved to the edge, lights cutting shallow cones into the black. The beams bent strangely, slicing as if they were being pulled by currents not of air, but of attention. The group edged forward as if they were walking toward a thing that might wake if disturbed. Nara's hand hovered over the observation tablet. "We should launch a probe," she whispered. "A soft one, no heavy pulses. Let the environment decide whether we're invited." Mara considered the protocols, long, patient lists of do's and don'ts that people write when they want their wording to stand in for bravery. Launch, she said, slow, tethered, visual feed only. The probe fell like a coin. For an instant, the live feed showed nothing but a depthless black. Then the camera adjusted. Shapes, faint like salt patterns beneath a microscope, flowed across the field, luminous and terrified and utterly alien. When the probe hummed and returned, a data packet whispered through the ship's network. The packet contained a waveform that Nara replayed until her lips were white. "It's not noise," she said finally. "It's a sequence. There's order in the frequency changes. That pattern correlates to," she swallowed, "to the syntax of vocalizations in primate species on Terra." There was a stunned silence. Jiro made a small, nervous sound that might have been laughter. "Are you telling me we found an echo of Earth's?" "Not a copy," Nara said. "A pattern overlap. The mathematics of the modulation resemble what social animals use for contact calls. But we have no evidence of life yet. There are too many unknowns." "Could be a geological mimic," Leo offered. "Stone can do some strange things under pressure." "Stone doesn't mimic primate syntax by accident," Nara answered. "Not convincingly." They set up camp a safe distance from the lip and watched. Night, if Harbor measured nights, came like a slow curtain falling in slow motion. The black inside the ring didn't shift. It held itself like a held breath. No stars reflected in it. The cameras tried to break the darkness and came back with numerical riddles. Around midnight, the first sound arrived. It was not sound so much as the feeling of being named. In their helmets, the crew heard a thin syllabic vibration pressed against the membranes, like someone speaking through a wall. Each of them, in their own mind space, felt a tug, a name that meant nothing in any language and everything in the private language of bones. Mara felt her throat constrict, and for a second she wondered whether she had always been called that thing before she remembered she was Mara Voss. "Do you hear?" Jiro started. "Yes," Nara said, the word small as breath. The instrument logs spiked with low-frequency oscillations that slid through the spectrum the way a hand slides through water. But the calls, if they were calls, weren't broadcast outward. Rather, they nested in the skull, wrapped around memory. Some of the crew reported flashes, faces they'd never seen, a ship once docked in some long-dead port, a child's hands covered in mud. The memories were not theirs, but the feeling that they belonged to someone familiar made them intimate. "We should retreat," Leo said, voice small. Mara understood the imperative, but curiosity sat in her like a rock. "We stay," she said. They stayed. Days, or intervals they labeled as days, passed in increments of observation and startled sleep. Food distribution became a ritual of small normalities. They would eat, monitor, discuss. At times, the aperture sent no calls at all. At times, it hummed a slow hymn that seemed to map the crew's dreams. Nara set up a lattice of sensors, and each night, the patterns accreted into a language-like structure. Call, pause, harmonics that matched no known natural resonance. When Nara ran the sequence against human languages, she found fragments that resembled lullabies. And when she cross-checked it with non-human social animals, the match was stronger. "We have a grammar," she said. "Not words, maybe phrases. It's interactive. It responds.
Mera caught herself talking to the black. She would say small things aloud. "We are explorers. We mean no harm." She framed them in protocols and legalese because those were the words that had weight. At first, nothing. Then the aperture shifted as if in acknowledgement, and a single syllable, or what they heard as a syllable, bled through. Not a word in any tongue, but a soft coil that tightened in the chest. Communication was not like speaking with a radio. It was like reading the weather. Each signal compressed into a feeling of hunger, boredom, nostalgia, curiosity. Once, when Mera walked the lip alone, it offered the sensation of a ship's keel rubbing a dock, the small, intimate friction of arrival. Mera found herself remembering a childhood trip she never took. A ferry across a gray bay and the smell of oil and coffee. The memory was precise to the taste and wholly unconnected to her real past. On the fifth interval, Nara proposed a test. If it's reacting to us, we can try offering something. She set up a small array of sound emitters tuned to produce simple pulses derived from whale song and the contact calls of primates. The emitters were primitive trinkets compared to the black, but they were human-made and therefore meaningful in a way professional equipment isn't. They played the pulses into the void. At first, nothing. Then the aperture replied in a chain, pulses that came back altered, braided with harmonics that the human ear could just catch. The returning pattern, when Nara slowed it and spread it into a readable form, formed a loop. When they looped it again and again, a shape the crew could not name began to assemble in their minds, a lattice of events that suggested an origin not of biology, but of intent.
What if it's recording? Leo suggested. Not living, but a thing that archives signals and arranges them. Or a sentinel, said Jiro. Some machine left behind to listen in the dark. Or it was alive in ways their words did not contain. The exchange continued and deepened. The aperture's calls became responsive, mimicking human cadence at times, and then bending into unhuman angularities. The crew laughed once as the black emitted a sequence that matched the rhythm of a nursery rhyme. They laughed because it was absurd, and because laughter is a human way of keeping fear small. On the seventh interval, the aperture advanced. It was subtle, tendrils of light undefined by wavelength, like gossamer filaments, slid out of the abyss and grazed the rock near their camp. The filaments were not luminous in a way their eyes could call color. They were luminous in the way certain memories were luminous, highlighted and hollowed out at once. When one brushed Leo's suit, it felt like a hand with no bones stroking his sleeve. Leo froze, then shouted, "Back!" Mera grabbed him and hauled him in. The suit alarm flashed a gentle, insistent red. Leo's face went pale within his helmet. His voice came out thin. "I saw a room, bookshelves, a window looking out at a sky I didn't know, and there was a smell, vanillin, like caramelized sugar. I know that smell and never had it." Nara's eyes were wet, curiosity and fear braided in them. The aperture is offering scenes, not just calls, it's playing, she said. Playing? Jiro echoed. Memories, said Nara. Or simulations of them.
it might be using fragments from whatever transmits through it. It's not just listening, it's curating. Mara thought of the children's books she'd read aboard transport ships, tales of islands that remembered sailors and returned them stories. If it's curating, what story does it want to tell us? They didn't get a clear answer. Instead, the aperture shifted tone. Its tendrils curled into the camp one night, and the air filled with a sound that was almost music, a low, repetitive humming that sorted itself into phrases that, when Nara mapped them, formed basic arithmetic sequences. It was as if the black wanted them to understand that it could count. Maybe it wants to catalog us, count us and index us like specimens, said Leo. Or it's trying to teach us to understand it, Nara answered. Language requires reference points. Counting is a shared scaffolding. Mara's sleep during those intervals became dangerous. She dreamed of a child collected from a long-ago shoreline, of a woman in a station kitchen stirring sugar until it smoked, of a ship's log that read simply, "We were called." She woke with words in her mouth that evaporated when she tried to write them.
The captain's log they were keeping, the official one, dry and precise, demanded caution. They were to collect data, not to engage in acts of cultural exchange. The company's legal department, in 100 green-fonted memos, reminded mariners that the first contact protocols existed to prevent the human tendency to anthropomorphize into catastrophe. But policies are paper nets. The deeper pattern that the aperture offered tightened like a tide. It began to reproduce faces, not random faces, but the faces of people each crew member knew, or thought they knew. Jiro saw an old flight instructor whose voice still lived in his bones. Nara, in the hum, found the face of her mother, not as she had last seen her, but as she might have been decades ago, young and angry and laughing. Leo saw someone he'd built a model robot with as a child. Mara saw, impossibly, the profile of a woman who had once stood on a ferry and waved to a dock in a city full of gulls. The memory that had arrived on the first night when she walked the lip. Is it feeding off memory? Leo asked. Is that how it learns or speaks? Could be, Nara said. Or it could be mirroring, reflecting whatever stimuli we present back to us in the only way it knows how. Which begged another question. Where were those memories coming from? They had not come from outside transmissions. The Ariadne's records showed no network links. Nothing from the crew's personal devices had been breached. So either the aperture had taps into some grand universal archive, a library of moments collected and stored in the dark, or it had access into the mind itself, into the neural fabric that stitched memory to perception. Mara decided to test it, not with instruments, but with intention. She stood on the lip and imagined a small, ordinary thing, the blue mug she kept in the Ariadne's galley, chipped at the rim, its underside scribbled with an old engineer's name in faded ink. She thought of the time she'd held that mug and let coffee cool on her tongue while the ship cut through plenty of empty space. She thought of the smell of grounds and the low hum of engines. She did not speak the memory out loud, but she held it like a secret. The aperture answered with a room and a mug and the faint scrape of ceramic on metal. This time, Mara felt something else, not just recognition, but hunger. The projection expanded, taking on dimensions beyond what she had offered. In the projection, there was a second cub, and in the second cub,
There was a mark from a hand that was not Mara's. The projection showed a meeting, hands touching on the edge of a table. Mara felt that touch and recoiled as if slapped. "Captain," Jiro called from behind her, "we need to—" But Mara could not leave the image. The aperture's tendrils braided around the scene in slow motion and presented an intimacy, an interchange of trust lost to time. The memory was not wholly hers, yet it was anchored to her cognition enough to be intimate. "We're being recorded, and not just recorded. It's taking fragments and rewriting them together." Nara's hands flew over the tablet. If it's recombining memories, it could construct scenarios that never existed. That's dangerous. The crew could be manipulated, emotionally and cognitively. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," said Mara. She forced herself to step back from the lip and to focus on the mission. We catalog, we withdraw, we do not let it rearrange us into something else. Withdrawal, like so many plans made on maps, is harder than the ink implies. The aperture apparently didn't want to be dismissed. It stepped its offerings outward, a sequence portraying an arrival of travelers in a harbor that looked like a mix of ancient seaport and orbital dock. The image was warm with lamplight. The travelers' faces were simple and human and heartbreakingly immediate. They carried crates and sacks, and one of them, small, quick, cheerful, looked up and smiled at the viewer.
Mara found she recognized the smile. It was a smile from a book. It was a smile she had scribbled in margin notes once, an embellishment she had given an unnamed protagonist. The aperture had pulled fiction and memory into an arrangement that subverted the crew's sense of private life. "Stop the exchange," Mara ordered. "Cut the feed. We log everything and we leave." They tried to pull back. Data packets thickened in the network, and then, with cruel subtlety, the aperture folded a scene that showed the Ariadne itself, open and empty, moored in a harbor of black water. In the projected scene, the Ariadne's ramp lowered and a small figure, hunched and careful, walked into the ship. The figure's face was their own, rearranged into a mask of yearning. "It's bait," Leo said, his voice thin. "It's offering us what we want. It's trying to keep us," finished Nara. Mara's thumb hovered over the comm to the ship. Protocol demanded they call for a remote extraction the moment a contact seemed hazardous. But extraction would mean leaving with 100 terabytes of unsorted, potentially unsafe data aboard. Company HQ would want that. The aperture would want them to keep it, or to come back. Leaving without the data might be an offense. "We remain," Mara said finally, "but I shut off the feed that invites the ship in. Nothing that simulates the Ariadne inside the aperture. No more personal projections." They hit the kill switch. The black fell silent like a snapped string. For a measured breath, the world seemed to exhale. Then, as if nothing had happened, the aperture changed its behavior. It reconfigured its calls into a logic that felt like a question. The patterns were not imitations now. They were invitations to a structure, a rhythm of approach and retreat that suggested a test. At the heart of it was an old, basic exchange that had built civilizations: trade. In the weeks that followed, the weeks the crew labeled carefully to keep their minds grounded, they negotiated with absence. The aperture offered images and sounds in exchange for objects. Small things, a copper bolt, a spool of wire, the chipped blue mug. When Mara stepped away, the aperture returned them altered. The bolt was engraved with a spiral not present before. The wire hummed with a low note when touched. The mug's chip had healed in the projection, leaving only an elegant curve that the real mug could not match. "What is it doing?" Leo whispered more than once. "Is it creating artifacts to seduce us?"
Maybe it wants to build a narrative we can accept. Maybe it can't truly speak, so it scaffolds meaning out of things we care about. They traded small curiosities, and in return the aperture revealed fragments of a history that might have been. The fragments were a mosaic of civilizations folded into the same archive. Children singing around a hearth, vessels docking under turquoise auroras, a machine that hummed to itself as it indexed voices. Each fragment, raw and incomplete, filed tiny notches into the crew's sense of time. Yet even as they traded, a nagging pattern surfaced. The aperture never presented its own face. It never offered a clear interior or a locus. It remained a hole with an intent that could be mapped but not visited. Their probes returned corrupted metadata and images with edges gone fuzzy. Even their most advanced remote instruments reported data loss the closer they approached the center.
"Whatever it is," Nara said one night as they cataloged another trade, "it's not preparing to host us. It's preparing to rewrite us." Mara looked up at the black aperture and thought of harbors on old maps where sailors left coins and prayers so the sea would favor their return. Perhaps that's all it was, a place that collected offerings and gave back narratives, so that any who arrived would leave with a story. Or perhaps, she did not say this aloud, it was calculating something more dangerous, colonization by intimacy. If you can rewrite what someone remembers of themselves, you can change who they are. The crew slept in fragments now, waking with impressions that might be their own or might be gifts from behind the lip. Sometimes, Mara would awaken convinced she had a scar on her left wrist, only to find the skin unbroken. Each repeated dream altered small things, a habitual pause when she reached for her mug, a sudden compassion for a childhood teacher she had disliked. Those changes were small at first, hardly worth the clinical notation in the log. But small things accrete. One morning, Jiro didn't come up from the hall maintenance bay. They found him curled on the deck, helmet off, eyes open and unfocused. He held in his hands a carved toy boat none of them had seen before, its hull engraved in geometric tatters. The toy smelled faintly of tar and of a seaward city he didn't come from. He stared at it like a man who had found an exact wrongness. "It came through the aperture," he whispered when they woke him. "I found it under the ramp. I swear I didn't put it there." "You didn't. We checked the feed. There was no breach." Jiro's fingers trembled. "I can hear it sometimes. A song, like the one my instructor used to whistle. But it's wrong. It changes the last note. I know it's changing it." Mara sat with him until the tremor passed. In the weeks that followed, the crew divided themselves into factions almost without trying. Those who wanted to study the aperture and treat it like an archive, and those who wanted to cut it loose and flee. The arguments were quiet at first, then louder. Fear and hunger braided the way members of a crew braided hope and caution on long journeys. Mara, as captain, felt both sides tug. The company's directives were simple: maximize knowledge yield, minimize crew risk. But the aperture was shaping them in ways the directives didn't account for. It could not be reasoned with by paperwork. The only tool left was human will. One night, when the aperture offered a panorama of an old market under lantern light, and a child selling trinkets who looked and moved like a younger Leo, Mara stepped forward and put her palm flat on the cooling rim of the lip. "Enough of tests. If you want exchange, take it, but you will not take our minds." The aperture hummed, as if amused. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the black opened, not with the sense of threat, but with an invitation so precise and crafted that Mara felt a memory rearrange itself.
a life where she had never left that small ferry dock, a life of simple exchanges and small, predictable disappointments. The invitation was a world of peace.
Mara had a choice: to step into a life that would be easy in the way dreams are easy, and stay lost in a comfort that was not entirely honest, or to stay and risk unraveling in the cold truth of the unknown. She stepped back. It was the right call, or at least it felt like the right call at the time. The aperture, not to be rebuffed lightly, escalated. Where it had offered images before, it now began to restructure the crew's environment. Tools misplaced themselves. The ship's clock, a mechanical relic that ticked like a second heart, gained a second hand that hesitated on certain ticks and then sped. The galley's cupboards lined up with memories that none of them owned. Cans labeled in languages that had been dead for centuries. Spices that smelled of storms. The Ariadne herself felt less like a machine and more like a place being read by somebody else. Nara recorded everything with the sort of fierce, methodical tenderness of a doctor tracking a novel disease. "If we leave," she said one morning when she handed Mara a tablet loaded with graphs, "we bring that with us. The aperture will have inserted itself into the data stream. The company will want to study it, dissect it. Whatever it is, it's now part of human record." Mara thought of the legal memos and the profit spreadsheets. She thought of long nights in the command chair, of lives balanced between risk and reward. Outside, Harbor's lip hummed an idle lullaby. It would offer someone else a harbor soon enough. That was its nature. "We contain it," she said finally. "We quarantine the data. We extract physical samples, but not the interactive feed. We preserve what is necessary and destroy the rest." That night, as they prepared to implement the plan, the aperture spoke in a tone none of them had heard before. Not the drifting hum or the playful mimicry, but a voice that had weight and a cadence like old timber. The voice did not form words they could pronounce. Rather, it arranged concepts: keeper, borrower, promise. Mara understood then that the aperture had a sense of reciprocity, not in the commercial sense, but in the moral. It had been built or had evolved to take fragments, to hold them, and to give them back in different forms. Perhaps it had saved the fragments from worse fates. Perhaps it had been a library. Perhaps it was hungry. "Promise?" Nara asked. "What does it want in return?" The aperture showed a sequence, a ship leaving a harbor with a catalog of fragments sealed in its hold. It showed the ship returning to clouds that shrouded a planet and depositing the fragments like seeds. The implication was ugly in its simplicity. If they left with the aperture's offerings, they would disseminate those rearranged memories across networks and habitats that would never consent to their rearrangement. Mara felt the weight of choice again. Keep the data and risk polluting countless minds. Destroy it and risk erasing knowledge that might prevent worse mistakes. Then, because choices themselves are not moral absolutes, but tools, she decided to gamble on containment. They cataloged, packaged, and sealed. They recorded and backed up and triple verified. They set fail-safes wired into the ship's hull in case anything came through the data stream like a virus.
It felt like building a wall around something that wanted to be shared. On the day they prepared to leave harbor, Nara came to Mara with an image she could not stop shaking over. On the tablet was a filament, a tendril of light the aperture had left wrapped around their anchor chain. When Nara magnified the image, she saw patterns inside the filament, not purely fractal forms, but something like script. "What is that?" Mara asked. Nara swallowed. "It's a signature, a record of contact, not just a mark, a promise of return." Mara looked at the aperture one last time. The black seemed to widen, like an eye opening in slow motion. It hummed a tone they had all come to recognize, one that could be translated roughly as farewell, or perhaps not farewell, but a bookkeeping note for a ledger whose columns none of them could read.
They left harbor and the aperture behind, engines humming a small, protesting song. As the Ariadne withdrew into transit, the crew watched the lip recede into a narrowing circle, and then into a pinprick of black. Behind them, the planet continued its indifference. For days afterward, the crew pretended normalcy, maintenance routines, dry log entries, the small domestic acts that re-establish habit. The data they had taken sat sealed in the hold, in drives wrapped in nested encryptions and physical wards. Nara insisted the data be held offline pending examination in a sterile environment. Mara put her signature on the quarantine forms with a hand that trembled. But Harbor had taken something with them anyway. The ship tasted different. The crew's dreams shared a recurrent motif. A harbor with a woman who smiled the same smile Mara had seen, and a child who handed each of them a carved boat. Jiro woke one morning with splinters under his fingernails that he did not own. Leo found his hands making shapes that matched patterns from the aperture's signature. They had tried to leave with the thing contained, and yet the thing had not been contained. Weeks later, in a bureaucratic alcove on a neutral orbital station, the company's analysts opened the quarantine for cursory review. They were curious, then fascinated, then, frankly, addicted. Human curiosity is a contagious thing. The files leaked into secure channels, then into less secure ones, and eventually into the wild. People who handled the data reported seeing a market scene at the lip of the aperture in their dreams. A freight pilot tweaked his course to pass near Harbor's system. A historian wrote a speculative paper titled "On Non-Anthropocentric Archives." The aperture's offerings were, quite literally, everywhere. Mara watched the cascade of dissemination and felt a coldness she could not name. She had quarantined, she had followed protocol, she had chosen containment, but containment had failed. The universe had a way of being porous where it mattered. Months later, a message arrived at the Ariadne's comms. It was an unofficial note from an analyst who had once worked with Nara and who had read more of the quarantine than policy allowed. He wrote, in a voice of someone who had seen too many things go wrong in the name of right, "You did what you could. It rewrites differently in everyone. Some have found peace. Some lose themselves. We must learn to refuse what cannot be given." Mara read the note in private and folded it into the ship's unofficial log. She thought of harbors that had once changed sailors and of the cousin she'd never known. She thought of the 1,000 small choices that define a life and wondered whether the aperture had not only taken and traded, but also tried to offer something we had long since forgotten: the possibility of being rewritten for the better. She did not know.
Harbor's aperture was an answer with too many dialects. Some days she believed the aperture was a librarian, or a predator, or a god with an ink-blot sense of humor. Other days she thought it might simply be a thing that gathered and rearranged, and the moral weight of that action lay not in what it did, but in what we did with what it offered.
The Ariadne kept moving outward into the dark. The crew tried to sleep. Nara continued her analyses with that fierce medical tenderness. Jiro carved tiny toy boats when the tremors came, setting them on the rail like offerings to something they no longer fully understood. Lio cataloged patterns until his hands shook, and then cataloged some more. And sometimes, in the deep hours before the ship's artificial dawn, for a moment, brief and terrible and impossible to explain, Mara would swear she felt, at the edge of the world, a ripple. Not an attack, but a beckon, as if the aperture had written its name across the universe and then folded it just enough to make it legible to anyone who cared to look. She closed her eyes and promised nothing. They told themselves the ordinary things. 2 weeks of isolation will blunt the edge of obsession. Quarantine will make data manageable. The company will send a neutral review team, and everything will be adjudicated by protocols written by humans who believed in checklists. They told themselves these things like prayers, because prayers are often the only durable thing in a world that insists on surprising you. Days bled into each other with an uneven tide. The Ariadne's crew became a ritualized mixture of duty and avoidance, where once they'd joke and braid one another's nerves with stories in the mess, conversation narrowed to the essentials: schedules, readings, maintenance, and the soft, necessary lie of forgetting. Nara kept her instruments warm and fed with power. Lio scraped and smoothed the hull, as if physical labor might sand down the edges the aperture had left on their souls. Jiro took the pilot's bench and hummed old training songs to keep his hands steady. Mara walked the corridors like a question she refused to pronounce. They kept a log of anomalies, which is to say, they kept a record of how the human mind folded under an object that did not share its assumptions. The log grew thick. It documented changes in appetite and the slow slippage of personal habits into collective rituals. The crew began to leave small tokens on Mara's desk without saying why: a strip of ribbon, a paper boat, a coin engraved with unknown sigils. Each token felt to Mara like a breadcrumb that led away from the person who had dropped it and toward the aperture's influence. Sometimes the tokens were useful, patterns the aperture had left behind, physicalized for reasons that remained indecipherable. Another time, the tokens were dangerous, a child's toy that Nara found wrapped around the ventilation shaft, and that, when she touched it, made her feel like she had never left a village by the sea. The toy might have been harmless in the hands of a child. In Nara's hands, it was a hook. "The risk is contagion," she said one afternoon in a voice that had shrunk to the size of a whisper. She pointed to a cluster of graphs showing sleep deviation rates climbing across the crew. The aperture's offerings create vectors of affect. If those vectors go off-ship through a trader, a station worker, a data analyst, they will spread. Emotional patterns propagate. We sealed the drives, encrypted, air-gapped. You can't air-gap a dream. Not fully. People carry fragments in their minds and leak them in conversation. The human mind is porous in ways you can't wall.
Mara wanted to be the captain who held to a decision with the firmness of a trained hand. She wanted to be the person who could simply execute orders and be done with the moral calculus. But she also felt the small corrosive certainty
that the aperture's influence was not merely a threat to be contained and cataloged, it was a question about human stewardship in a universe that kept surprising them. On the 21st interval, the Ariadne's comms lit up with a message they had not expected, an official company directive. It arrived with bureaucratic polish, a header code, timestamps, and the terse summaries of risks and rewards. Headquarters ordered them to return to port and surrender the physical samples and the data drives for an in-depth review. They were to be debriefed and then reassigned. The message allowed for no ambiguity and no interpretation. "It's what we asked for," Nara said in a voice that did not carry gratitude. "We have to hand it over." Mara read the directive and watched the edges of the crew's patience fray into something else. For some, the order was a relief, an exit ramp from the slow gravity of Harbor's effect. For others, it was a betrayal. To hand the Aperture's offerings wholesale to people in suits meant the stories would bleed into commerce and policy before anyone could understand them. "We agreed to containment for a reason," Maris said aloud. "If we turn this over to the company in the way they want, they'll monetize the data. They'll weaponize fragments. They will turn memories into product." "You're drawing a picture you don't have enough pieces for," Jiro said in a voice that did not carry gratitude. "We follow orders. It's not on us." Mara felt the responsibility of command like nothing else in her career. There was no manual for deciding whether an archive had rights or whether a phenomenon that rearranged memory required consent. The protocols were blank where imagination reached. They prepared to comply. They packed the drives with redundancy and sealed the samples in the hold. They made lists and checklists and double checklists. The ritual of paperwork is reassuring because it creates weight and shapes it into something you can carry. On the morning they prepared to lift port, a new signal arrived, not in their comms, but in the pattern of their dreams. It was an encoded request they had not expected. The Aperture wasn't simply asking to be studied or shared, it wanted an emissary. Nara was the first to report the request. She had been up late analyzing the spectral return when the pulse settled into a cadence she had previously logged as being question-like. When she translated it, there was a single recursive symbol that repeated like a ring drawing itself smaller, a pattern that, loosely, meant approach. "It's asking for an emissary," she said. Mara's stomach flipped. "As in a person?" "As in a bridge," Nara said. "A bridge. A being who will carry questions into the dark." But the message was ambiguous. It could be a trap. Jiro filled the silence. "Do we send someone? Company will be pissed, but if it's genuine..." "If we send someone," Leo said, voice small, "they might not come back as they were." They argued in hushed tones. An emissary suggests trust. It suggests negotiation. It suggests a different order of ethics. If the Aperture had an intention beyond mere curiosity, then perhaps being the one to answer that invitation would be an act of diplomacy not yet codified by any human framework.
Mara found herself thinking of old stories told by her grandmother, mariners who left offerings at rocks that were thought to be sacred and who sometimes brought back blessings and sometimes curses. The stories never prescribed what to do. They existed as accounts of the gamble. "We need to know more before we appoint anyone," she said. "We can't send someone in blind. We design a probe with intentionality. It won't be instruments alone. It will carry a human presence in a form that can be translated." So they built an emissary, not a person, but a vessel for presence. Nara led the design, weaving biological rhythms into code and sensory feedback into hardware. They hollowed an auditory probe with a throat that could mimic human intonation, encoded a small neural model that could adapt, not too human, just enough to approximate curiosity. The probe would be tethered, protected, and equipped with a failsafe that would isolate it if contamination occurred. It would be a compromise between instrument and ambassador. They called it the palimpsest because it would carry human traces and be ready to be written over. The name felt right in a way that did not need more argument. When they launched the palimpsest into the aperture, they did it with the ritual of people who know how fragile the things they love are. Each crew member touched the probe before launch, leaving a small token on its casing, a thread from Jiro's training jacket, a scrap of paper with Nara's hand-drawn symbols, a chip of paint from Leo's last repair. They sealed the tethers and watched the device descend. For a while, the feed showed only the slow, impossible black. Then the palimpsest's cameras registered an internal architecture, not of space, but of suggestion. A columned atrium that seemed built from memory itself, columns made of laminae that folded into text and texture. The feed's audio channel picked up a chorus of impulses that the palimpsest translated into a tone that approximated a greeting. The aperture, through its field, offered images like currency, pages of a ledger that we could not read but could feel. It presented the history of a place that had once been an intersection of travelers, archives, and repositories. The palimpsest returned fragments of human life in reply, a lullaby, a drawing, an apology. The two traded, not words, but feeling logic, and in the trade, an understanding began to form.
Nara, watching the feed, cried quietly. "It's a repository," she said. "Not predatory by intent. It houses and rearranges. Maybe it was made by something that could no longer travel and decided to gather the traveling things instead. Maybe it saves things the universe forgot." Mara liked the theory, but feared the implication. If the aperture saved things, should they be rescued? Who had the right to decide where fragments go? The palimpsest's success complicated their quarantine, because if the aperture's function was archive, then destroying its artifacts might be a kind of cultural vandalism. The palimpsest transmitted a pattern that translated roughly as a question, "Steward?" The question read like a contract. It was an offer to exchange custodianship for consent to be studied in a more careful manner, not by corporate hands, but by a community trained to listen. The response from company headquarters was swift and decisively corporate. There was no room in the legalese for a steward model. The company wanted material and market, not long-term guardianship. They reiterated their demand: return immediately and hand over the samples. Mara risked insubordination in thinking of an alternative. She realized she could not, in good conscience, hand the aperture's offerings to people who saw them only as commodities. The steward model required time and trust, and bodies who could resist the pressure to monetize. She made her choice. "We don't hand them anything," she told Nara and Jiro. "We propose a stewardship. We suggest a neutral consortium, a set of scientists, ethicists, and custodians, and we delay delivery pending negotiation. We inform HQ and request a delay." "You'll be accused of theft," Jiro said. "Of negligence,"
Nara agreed, and of emotional interference. Mara accepted the indictment before it could be read aloud. She sent a message to headquarters proposing the steward plan with full transparency and a demand for time. Predictably, the reply was terse: comply or we will issue a recall code and escort. The sea of bureaucracy is patient. It can wait for fear to be worn down. The crew braced for the worst: an armed escort, legal action, or worse, recall and reconditioning. The aperture, for its part, did not remain patient. The exchange via the palimpsest deepened. It offered stories not as discrete artifacts, but as connections. Here was a memory of a child learning to thread beads, and beside it was a memory of a woman teaching a child to read. The aperture linked them as part of a larger tapestry. Each link made the crew feel both honored and exposed, chosen as recipients of things larger than their own private histories.
One night, as the standoff with headquarters intensified, the palimpsest transmitted a set of images that stopped everyone on the Ariadne in the same exhausted way. They were portraits, not of individuals, but of communities, gatherings around fires, ceremonies of handing over tokens to an elder, a ledger being opened and closed. The visual language read like an instruction manual for caretaking. Maybe it always intended to find a steward, Nara said. But why choose us? Leo asked. Maybe because we stayed, Jiro said. Because most ships get bored and leave. Mara felt the weight of the implied election. The aperture had placed a responsibility on them by acknowledging their presence. Whether that was an honor or a manipulation depended, she realized, on what they did with it. They drafted the steward proposal with all the care and political language they could muster. They sent the document with attached footage of the palimpsest's interactions. The reply was complicated. HQ asked for more data. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to know what the shelves would become if such exchanges spread beyond controlled channels. In other words, was this a resource or a risk? While the back and forth continued, the crew's internal divisions hardened. Some wanted to keep negotiating. Some wanted to capitulate. Arguments flared in unexpected places, during meals, in the engine room, in the cramped privacy of the sleeping ward. Emotions once gently managed turned raw. Then an incident occurred that changed everything. An off-ship trader, a small freighter with a hull patched more times than its manifest showed, returned to Harbor's system on its own. The freighter's captain had been an early reader of the leaked quarantine reports and had taken a course alteration to pass near the system. He did not know Harbor's coordinates in detail. He followed rumor and speculation and the peculiar human itch that makes people chase mystery like a drug. He passed the orbit. He broadcast a brief signal. He asked for permission to observe from a distance. His call was polite and non-threatening. The crew agreed. They were being cautious, and a stray observer wasn't a risk in itself. But the freighter's presence sent a ripple through Harbor that the Ariadne screens registered as a whole-body tremor. The aperture's rhythm stepped faster. The palimpsest feed, which had been calm and conversational, spiked into a chorus of images that the probe struggled to sync. Patterns that were once gentle became urgent.
The freighter's captain, who had never physically set foot near the aperture, reported that in the middle of the night he had dreams of sitting at a table and being offered a carved boat that smelled of tar. He awoke and found a toy on his bunk.
The freighter's crew broke quarantine. Someone had left harbor with a fragment. The smallest breach made the most dangerous wave: contamination. The Ariadne's team scrambled to track the freighter. They sent messages pleading for containment. They offered to buy time with whatever authority they still had. But when they intercepted the freighter's open channel, they found that the captain, far from being malicious, had been changed. He was quieter, gentler. He spoke in tones of wonder and grief. He wanted the world to know what he had seen. "That's the pattern of contagion," Nara said after the call. "People who touch the artifacts carry them like seeds. They spread images and songs. The hospice of the archive becomes diaspora." Mara's decision to resist HQ's demands suddenly felt both right and too late. Containment had failed, not because they had been naive, but because the human heart is a porous thing, and because the aperture's influence could hitch a ride on curiosity. What they had to do now was triage, contain as much as possible, mitigate harm, and set up a network of stewards and caretakers who could receive artifacts without being consumed by them. Mara began to think in terms of ecosystems instead of property law. If the aperture was an archive, it required curators who were trained, ethical, and possibly immune to the kinds of emotional rearrangements that could make anyone a carrier. She reached out again to HQ with a revised plan, one that accepted staged, transparent dissemination to a vetted network of cultural institutions and guardians. She framed the argument in honor of cost-benefit analysis. Slow release with oversight would reduce the risk of contamination while maximizing the potential for insight. This time, the response was not merely corporate, it was political. Other corporations, contractors, and agencies picked up the signal like moths to flame. The orbital microphones buzzed with offers. Universities wanted access, militaries wanted possibilities, private collectors wanted relics. The idea of a stewarded release became an intersection in a larger, uglier marketplace. Mara felt besieged. The Ariadne's deck hummed with tension. The crew, grown thin, made hard choices. Some wanted to comply to avoid blood and legal exposure. Others wanted to fight. They voted in a quiet, contentious meeting and chose to proceed with the Steward Network in defiance of HQ's immediate recall order. They formalized their decision with signatures and with the tacit consent of their own consciences. When they dispatched their motion into company channels, the response was swift: a recall code and an order to surrender the Ariadne. The ship's name was flagged in the system. They were to be met by a corporate escort. Mara prepared for a confrontation she had no reason to believe she could win. She also prepared for the darker possibility that in the moment of conflict, someone would use the aperture's artifacts as leverage. Human actors in crisis behave in predictable ways: fight, then flight. They had to assume that the stakes would draw out the worst. They did not expect the escalation to come from inside the ship. Leo, whose need for certainties had always moved him toward the safe and the tidy, failed. He found a pendant in the storeroom, a small object the aperture had left on a maintenance rack. The pendant fit his hand in a way that felt like place. In it, he saw a life where the things he'd lost grew back, an apprenticeship completed, a friend forgiven, a house rebuilt. He took it as solace.
Solace in the presence of the aperture is often indistinguishable from surrender. Leo disappeared into the lower corridors that night and did not return to the central deck. He was later found in the engine room, herding parts into a crude shrine, muttering his grandmother's name in a string of borrowed vowels. He had turned his cabin into an altar of fragments. Where once he recorded patterns, he now curated them alone. When confronted, he cried and begged not to be made to leave. He said the artifacts made him whole. He demanded they be allowed to stay, to integrate the fragments into his life. He refused to see the risk. Mara faced him with the hard responsibilities of a captain whose crew she loved. She explained quarantine, contagion, and stewardship. She ordered him to relinquish the pendant. He clutched it like a newborn. The conflict that followed was intimate and terrible. The aperture's influence does not create violence in the sense of malice. It creates conflict because it rebuilds a life from pieces, and anyone who is offered that gift will cling. Leo lashed out in despair and rage. He struck Mara once, a blow that stunned more from the fact of its tenderness than its force. He held the pendant to his chest and refused to let go. They restrained him with soft binds and with sorrow. He was sedated and confined. The captain's log recorded the incident with clinical distance, but the crew understood. An ethics had been cleaved in half. One side sought to hold on to the gift, the other sought to save the many from the fates of the few. They prepared to hand over Leo to the company when the corporate escort arrived. The escort, a sleek shuttle with white panels and an arrogance like a brand, docked with the Ariadne. 2 officers boarded with official faces and sterile smiles. They had the aura of people whose job it was to make choices for others.
The handover was procedural and public. Paperwork passed hands. The officers asked questions about contamination. The crew answered with reports and logs. The officers nodded in efficient comprehension. There was a moment when it seemed like the corporate machinery would take Lio away and the crisis would be over. But the aperture did not abide being taken as prize. Just as the transfer was being processed, the palimpsest, still tethered within the aperture by a long fiber-optic umbilical, emitted a sequence that rippled across the ship's network. Images appeared on corridor displays without permission. A series of faces smiling with the same small secret knowledge that the aperture had once offered to the crew. People in the shuttle saw those smiles and something unclenched in their eyes. They stepped back from the paperwork into the echo of memory. What the Ariadne's crew saw next was impossible to describe without sounding petty. The escort's commander, a woman whose badge glittered with promotions and whose jaw had never been unintentional, looked at the pendant and looked at Lio, and then sat down as if overcome by exhaustion. Her hands trembled. The small boat of her own childhood, a memory she had never shared, swam up like a ghost. She looked at Lio, not with judgment, but with the sudden softness of someone who remembered being fragile. "Keep him," she said at last. The word landed in the air like a blessed thing. The tension shifted. It dissolved in a way that was almost the aperture's signature move, reframe the crisis as a narrative, and the story changes shape. Mara did not know how to process this mercy. Was it mercy or a manipulation? It didn't matter. In the space where force had failed, an unexpected compassion had opened up. The officers left, their orders rescinded or inexplicably amended. They took with them a small box of data, a sample the company could use as precedent, and left. The Ariadne remained. After the shuttle departed, the crew sat in a circle on the main deck and tried to speak about what had happened. They were exhausted and relieved and frightened in equal measure. Lio apologized in raw, halting sentences. He relinquished the pendant, then retook it, then left it on the table. He, like many of them, had crossed a line between longing and reason. Nara closed her eyes and let the silence expand. We are not the first to be chosen, and we will not be the last to be altered. The aperture offers a solace that is seductive. It offers a way to stitch lives back together. We have to decide whether to accept being healers for a world that may not be able to refuse being healed. Mara looked at each of them and felt an ache she could not name. The steward proposal had failed to gain traction with any entity that could impose itself on the situation. The company's appetite had been momentarily chilled, but the wider world had seen the leak, and the idea of the archive had become variously weapon and balm. The aperture's offerings were out in the wild.
She made a new, harder choice. If the world could not be trusted not to exploit the aperture's artifacts, then the duty of caretaking would not be satisfied by an external consortium that might fragment the archive for profit or for power. The duty would have to be undertaken by people who could resist such pressure, by those who had already been near enough to be altered and thus were unlikely to sell what had made them whole. They formed a plan in whispers and with an odd courage. They would create an informal network of stewards, ships, stations, and individuals they had met in their travels who had the right temperament. They would keep the archive's items within a guarded chain that prioritized well-being over cataloging. They would train custodians to receive fragments and to help them integrate without being consumed. It was a naive plan, and yet it was a moral one. It also required leaving the Ariadne. They could not remain where the aperture had its locus. Harbor had claimed them in ways they could not fully reject. To be stewards required mobility, a dispersed net rather than a single node. They prepared then to depart with as many safe artifacts as they could anonymize, and with the palimpsest still tethered to its source. The fiber optic tether would remain, a lifeline to the archive, but they would travel outward with custodians in training. When they left harbor that time, their departure felt less like retreat and more like migration. The aperture watched them go not with malice, but with a kind of ledgered melancholy. It had given them things and taken things in the same invisible stroke. They felt the impression of its presence in their dreams and in the small tokens they carried. The first stop on their steward route was a small orbital library, a place funded by private donors and a handful of academic institutions. It was not perfect, but it had people who believed in the ethic of care. They handed over a selection of artifacts under strict, negotiated conditions. They taught the librarians protocols for handling. They trained volunteers in ways to receive and moderate fragments as if they were contagious plants. Months stretched into a year of fragile successes and ugly setbacks.
Some custodians survived their contact with the fragments and learned to weave the memories into their own lives without losing who they were. Others did not. A steward in a coastal station restructured his identity and left his family, believing he was destined to be a vessel for the archive. He vanished into an old port, and the rumors say he found peace. Another curator could not withstand the constant influx and developed a dissipative pathology that required intervention. Mara, who had once thought of herself as made of steady professional choices, discovered the limits of abstract planning. The human component of stewardship demanded more than policy. It demanded practices of compassion and refusal that were not easily taught. Nara kept analyzing the feed. Over time, she built models that showed patterns of contagion and resilience. She mapped thresholds and found techniques that might reduce the risk of absorption: ritualized contextualization, graduated exposure, and community-based integration. The measures were primitive and hopeful, but they worked in places. Where rituals were followed, contagion was less lethal to identity. Where rituals were ignored, people tended to fold around the memory and lose edges.
Jiro found a new kind of peace in carving. He made tiny toy boats and left them at docks as offerings. People began to collect them in the same way they collected prayers. The boats were small talismans of a voyage and a promise. Despite their efforts, the Aperture's artifacts continued to leak. Traders would arrive with stories, data would jump, people would dream shared images. The archive had become part of human culture, sometimes as blessing, sometimes as plague. Debates raged on planets and in stations. Was the Aperture a miracle or a threat? Should it be destroyed? Should it be embraced? The world answered in 1,000 contradictory ways. Years later, when Mara was older and the edges of her face had the soft grain of time, she received a message that made her fingers still, a transmission from a station that had been among the first in the Steward network. It contained a small packet and a short note. "We found the beginning." Nara pored over the packet and felt her laugh come out like a small, shocked thing. The packet contained a pattern that predated the forms they'd known, a signature the Aperture had left like a seed in its oldest deposits. It was not merely a record of passengers and tokens, but included a notation that looked like an instruction: preserve, pass, and remember. "That sounds trivial," Jiro said beside her, "but it's not. It shows intention." "Intention is morally complicated," Nara replied. "It could be a directive, a wish to be stewarded, or a trap, or both." Mara looked at the pattern and then at the image of harbor in her mind, the black lip and the tendrils of light that had shaped so many lives. She thought of the woman who had smiled at the ferry and the child with the toy boat. She thought of the way the Aperture had bound them into a new responsibility. She made another choice then, one that was as small as her breath and as large as a promise. She would make a journey back to harbor, not to retake, not to rescue, but to offer reciprocation. It was time for reciprocity. If the Aperture had given them stories and fragments, perhaps there was a way to give back that would not weaponize memory. She gathered a small team: Nara, who understood the patterns, Jiro, who knew the paths, and a new member, a woman named Seema, a social anthropologist they'd recruited from the Steward network. Seema's job was to learn to hold story as a living thing without being consumed by it. She was young and brave in the direct way of those who had never been made brittle by long disappointment. They set course for harbor again, not as conquerors, but as supplicants. They had no plan to remove the archive. They only wanted to offer to place a ledger on the lip,
a record of what they had taken and what they had given, and an affirmation that the world had learned to steward the fragments as best it could.
When harbor came into view the second time, it looked different. Perhaps it was simply the way memory colors things, but Mara swore the ring of obsidian cliffs glinted like a thing that had taken a polish. The aperture yawned as before, and the sky folded around it like a cloak. They approached in silence and anchored at a respectful distance. The palimpsest, which had been reconfigured into a portable envoy, listened and transmitted their offerings in a sequence designed by Nara and Seema together. They laid out their ledger, a digital archive, sealed artifacts, and a program designed to assist the aperture in cataloging, if it wished. It was a gift and a treaty. The aperture received without fanfare. Its response was not the intoxicating intimacy of personal memories, but a slow, patient series of shapes that suggested acknowledgement. It returned a set of images, a harbor perhaps older than their models predicted, vessels that docked and left, hands that passed tokens like prayers. It offered no names, but the pattern contained a kind of recognition. In the exchange, something like mutual trust formed, fragile and luminous. They left harbor again, and this time it felt different. The aperture still sang in their dreams, but the tone had changed. Not wholly possession, but a cadence that suggested negotiation. In their absence, a rumor spread through the steward net that the aperture had been willing to learn certain constraints of interaction. Whether those constraints would hold in the long run depended on countless acts of refusal and reception across a human tapestry not known for restraint. Mara continued to travel with the steward net, living in the cracks between caution and hope. Years accumulated like the rings of a slow tree. She read the ledger they had left and found in it a small, unexpected note, a sequence the aperture had given them that was not easily translated. It contained a rhythm that made no sense in their metrics, but felt like the sound of a harbor's tide. She kept the note in a drawer, and on nights when the world seemed especially cruel or indifferent, she would open it and listen to the pattern the way one listens to a lullaby. At the end, when age had taught her the proper value of small decisions, Mara recorded a message and placed it in the ledger they carried from port to port. She did not attempt to resolve the ethical ambiguities of the archive. Instead, she told a simple story about a harbor and the way a ship learns to remember. She wrote about the small things, the chipped mug, the toy boats, and the feel of tar under fingernails. She wrote about the people who had become stewards and those who had been lost to the lure of healing. And she wrote, quietly, that stewardship is a practice not of possession, but of care. She signed the ledger, Captain Mara Voss, steward by intent. Somewhere beyond harbor, people still argue. Some call the aperture a gift. Others call it a contagion. New stewards are being trained and old ones fail, and some succeed. That is the nature of things that are not resolved by laws and spreadsheets. They are lived in debates, not decrees. They are unfinishable dances. And sometimes, on still nights, when the stars are sharp and the ship creaks in the way old things do, Mara hears a sound like a tide in a throat.
It is not a command nor a plea. It is simply a note repeated across the dark, as if someone somewhere had written a name and then folded it into the margin of a book.
She does not know whether the aperture will ever be tamed, or whether it was ever meant to be tamed at all. She knows only that when you are given a thing that can rewrite the world's stories, your first duty is to decide whether you will use it to hurt or to heal. That choice is small and necessary and never absolute. The ledger sits on her shelf now, a record of a life threaded with harbor songs. Occasionally, someone asks to read it. She lets them, and then asks them afterward the small question she has learned to ask: what will you do with what you take? Some refuse to answer. Others tell her everything. The conversation is ongoing. And in the quiet that follows, when the ship's lights dim and the hum of life slows, Mara sometimes imagines harbor's aperture like a great eye that has learned to blink. She wonders whether, if the eye closes for long enough, the world will forget the archive at its center, or whether that thing will continue to keep in its patient geometry the fragments of 1,000 would-be lives. She hopes, because hope is the only small rebellion she can afford, that when people stand at the lip of any harbor, they will remember the bargain the Ariadne's crew made, to refuse the easy god of rewriting, and to practice instead the far harder craft of holding. The Steward Network had become a living thing, sprawling, fragile, full of contradictions and difficult to manage, like a creature pulling itself in different directions. Some nodes thrived, small research rings, monastery-like listening posts, a floating habitat in the belt where people moved softly as if in a library. Others collapsed under the weight of their own enthusiasm or fear, dissolving into rumor and mythology. The Ariadne drifted between these places like a caretaker checking on sick children. 2 years had passed since the first contact with harbor's aperture, and time had not dulled its influence. If anything, the fragments had grown more cunning. Some artifacts now carried secondary effects, not harmful, but emotionally adhesive. A carved pendant that made its carrier crave quiet places. A copper ring that triggered memories of rain on a childhood roof, even in those who had grown up under orbital ceilings. A page-like object that smelled faintly of someone the holder once loved. "These aren't attacks," Nara said during one long diagnostic session aboard the Ariadne. "They're invitations." "Invitations to what?" Jiro asked, leaning over her shoulder. "To rewrite the self," she whispered. The more they studied, the more it became clear that the aperture behaved less like a machine and more like ecology, a forest of memory with roots reaching through time and canopy spread across perception. It made sense if one viewed the cosmos not as dead matter, but as a place that archived its own experience. Then harbor's aperture was simply the gardener. But gardeners prune, shape, and consume.
It happened during their 8th steward circuit. The Ariadne received a transmission, faint, encoded in a format they had never used, but somehow intimately familiar. The message came not through radio, but through the palimpsest dormant tether, still linked to harbor at the molecular level. Seema was the first to notice the pattern shift. "It's not requesting," she murmured. "It's warning." What? About what? Nara ran the sequence through half a dozen interpretation models and watched the results converge into one meaning: return. The aperture was calling them back, but this wasn't like before. There was no soft hum, no emotive invitation. This was directive, urgent, rhythmic, an encoded knock on a sealed door. Something's changed at Harbor, Nara said. Something big. They didn't debate long. Duty, or perhaps obligation, overruled fear. The Ariadne aligned course within the hour. As they slipped into transit, Seema asked the question that had been crawling behind all their thoughts. What if it's dying? No one answered. Harbor looked the same, and yet horribly different. The ring cliffs shimmered as if rippling under unseen stress. The basin's blackness churned like a storm inside a sealed jar. Tendrils of light lashed upward, then fell back into the abyss as though the aperture were breathing too hard. It's destabilizing. It's losing coherence, Nara whispered. The palimpsest, even before deployment, buzzed with feedback. Its sensors trembled as if excited and afraid. The ship itself felt heavier, as if gravity had thickened. Mara locked her jaw. Prep descent. They approached the aperture's lip the way mourners approach a grave. The first communication came before they even initiated scan cycles. It hit the ship like a shockwave. Images and feelings broadcast with no structure. Threads of memory lashed across the Ariadne's internal systems. Lights flickered. Screens displayed fractured faces, half familiar, half strangers. Then came a single repeating symbol, fracture. Something has broken inside it, Nara said, gripping the console, or is about to. Can we help it? Seema asked. Maybe, Nara answered, if we understand the failure. And if we don't, Jiro said. Mara's expression hardened. Then we witness. We do not abandon it.
The palimpsest entered the aperture like a final candle lowered into a storm cellar. Its feed showed chaos. The once organized memory halls, those imagined sensory architectures, now twisted and folded in on themselves. Scenes overlapped impossibly. A child singing at the same time a city burned. A ship docking while a storm swallowed a coastline. A classroom where sheets of rain fell through the ceiling from a sky that wasn't there. Nara's voice trembled. It's collapsing its catalog. The layers are merging. This is catastrophic. Can we stop it? Seema asked again. We don't even know what it is. Then the palimpsest found something. Deep within the churning architecture lay a core chamber, a place the aperture had never shown them. A sphere of swirling, luminescent strands pulsed as if breathing. But the strands frayed and snapped, scattering fragments through the chamber. It's losing integrity, Nara said. If this core unravels completely, the entire archive may scatter into the fabric of space, uncontrolled, unfiltered, everywhere. Like a psychic supernova, Mara whispered. And humans would be exposed to uncontrolled memories, untethered, non-human, possibly non-linear. Seema paled. It would break us. It was then the aperture sent the clearest message they had ever received. Help me hold. Not words, but understanding pressed directly into their minds. The aperture wanted stability, containment, continuity, a steward not just for its artifacts, but for itself. The Ariadne gathered in the central deck. The air was heavy with the weight of cosmic moral calculus. They stood surrounded by hums and flickering lights, listening to the aperture's transmissions, each pulse a gasp from the dying archive. What does it want us to do? Jiro asked. Anchor it, Nara said.
It can't maintain structural boundaries. It needs a mind, a stable mind to act as scaffolding. You mean, Seema swallowed, a person? Mara finally said the thing they were all afraid of. It needs a human host. Silence swallowed the room. A host would act as a stabilizer, a cognitive anchor. But such a person would no longer be entirely themselves. They would inherit the aperture's recursive memory logic. They would live between realities. They would never leave harbor. It's a terrible idea and a worse sacrifice, Jiro said. It's also the only way to prevent a memory catastrophe. If it collapses, billions could be affected through dream contagion. They considered sending a second palimpsest, but the aperture pulsed a refusal. It needed consciousness, human, present, anchored. Seema stepped forward first. I'll do it. No, Mara said instantly. You're new. You don't know the aperture's full weight. I trained for this, my whole field. Your field is anthropology, not self-annihilation, Jiro snapped. Seema's eyes softened. It wouldn't be annihilation. It would be transformation. That word made Leo flinch. Nara shook her head. We need someone deeply familiar with the archive, someone it already understands. Slowly, all eyes turned to Mara. She felt it, the aperture's attention, the subtle tug, the recognition. Of course, it had always been her, not chosen, but entangled.
Harbor had anchored itself in her dreams since the first return. It had shaped the ledger, the stewardship, the very philosophy they had built. She carried the aperture in her bones, whether she wanted it or not. And now, it was asking her to carry it forever. Mara, Jiro whispered, don't. She looked at each of them. Nara, the scientist who wanted truth. Jiro, the pilot who had carved boats for comfort. Seema, the anthropologist who saw story as sacred. Leo, recovering but still fragile, holding a toy boat in trembling hands. I'm the only one who can do this without breaking. No one can do this without breaking, Nara replied softly. Then I break in the direction that does the least harm. She walked to the ramp before anyone could protest further. I order you to stay on the ship. If this works, the aperture stabilizes. If it doesn't, leave and seal harbor forever. Mara, that's an order. It was the last order Captain Mara Voss ever gave. When Mara stepped to the aperture's lip, the black rose like a tide to meet her. The world narrowed to a single breath. Then, everything opened. She fell, and rose, and dissolved, and formed, and became. The palimpsest's feed went white, then gold, then filled with the faces of people Mara had never met, and children she had never held, and cities she had never walked. A lifetime of lives flooded through her, not as assaults, but as gentle, luminous threads asking only to be held together. She anchored them. She let them flow through her mind as if she were a loom. She wove the archive into coherence. She felt herself thinning, stretching, dissolving at the edges, but in the center, at the core,
She remained Mara Voss, a steady presence wrapped in a universe of echoes. And then slowly, the aperture calmed. The core stabilized. The architecture rebuilt itself. The storm subsided. A new symbol pulsed through the tether. Keeper. Not stolen, not sacrificed, not erased. Keeper.
The Ariadne waited for hours, maybe days. Time lost meaning near the aperture's pulse. Finally, the palimpsest returned a signal. A single image. The lip of the harbor. A silhouette standing at its edge. But it wasn't quite Mara. Yet it was. An echo. A projection. A guardian woven from her consciousness. Nara cried openly. Jiro held the railing so hard his knuckles bled. Seema whispered a prayer. Leo, strangely serene, said, "She's singing." And she was. Through the tether came a low, rhythmic hum. The sound of tide in a throat. The sound Mara had always heard in her dreams. The aperture had a steward now, a true one. A living mind anchored at its center. "Mara?" Nara whispered. "Can you hear us?" A pulse came in reply. "Yes." Another, "Go." Another, "Steward wisely." Another, "I hold." And then the tether dimmed to a soft, steady glow, the heartbeat of a stabilized archive. They left harbor with grief braided into pride. Seema wrote the first entry of the new steward ledger. The archive lives. The keeper remains. We continue her work. Jiro placed a carved boat on the Ariadne's console. Nara archived every last byte of the communication. Leo placed his pendant onto the altar and whispered, "Thank you." And harbor, once a threat, once a wonder, once a wound, became something else entirely, a lighthouse.
Years passed, but the universe did not forget harbor. No matter how far the Ariadne drifted, or how many worlds the Steward Network reached, the memory of the aperture, of Mara Voss, remained a gravity of its own. Some believed harbor had become a myth. Some believed it had become a god. Some believed it was a wound in physics that should never have been tended. But one truth endured. The aperture was no longer wild. It was no longer collapsing. It held because Mara held. And the world shifted around that truth. Seema became the first official coordinator of the Steward Archive, though she always said she wasn't chosen, only left behind. Under her, the Steward Network blossomed into an actual institution. Listening posts were established, where people trained not just to study artifacts, but to emotionally brace for them. Rituals were created, grounding exercises, identity affirmations, memory maps to help people distinguish what was theirs from what was borrowed. The palimpsest was upgraded, not as an emissary now, but as a bridge, a translator between Mara's voice and the worlds that sought guidance. Lio took on a quiet role. He built a small workshop inside the Ariadne, where he carved memory-safe replicas of harbor's items. Symbolic gestures, anchors for trauma survivors. Boat after boat after boat. Small, imperfect, all beautiful. Jiro remained Mara's defender. If anyone questioned the sacrifice she made, he cut them off with a
calmness that could freeze steel. Nara, however, changed. Not corrupted, not broken, but transformed by the responsibility. She became the network's foremost theorist, mapping the structure of all known memory ecologies. Her name began appearing in academic journals across the systems. Yet in private moments, she confessed a fear. I don't know if we saved Mara, or if we simply gave the aperture a face that comforts us. The question haunted her. It was inevitable. One day, someone would return to harbor, not out of duty, but out of longing. The first was a girl no older than 16. Her name was Lessa, and she had been found wandering the docks of a fringe mining station, clutching a replica boat she had carved from scrap. She claimed she dreamed of harbor every night. She claimed the keeper called her by name. When the stewards approached her gently, she said a sentence that froze the blood in every room where it echoed. She told me I could visit her. Seema asked softly, "Who?" Lessa smiled, a sad, small smile. "The woman in the black water." Leo nearly dropped the mug in his hands. Nara's face went white. Jiro whispered, "Mara." They debated heavily, ethics, risk, protocol, but the girl insisted, and the palimpsest confirmed the transmission. Safe. Bring child. Anchor learns. So they brought her. The journey was quiet, sacred. As harbor came into sight, Lessa pressed her forehead to the viewport. "It feels like going home," she whispered. The crew exchanged frightened looks. They stood at the aperture's lip, the black glassy surface shimmering like the eye of something ancient and patient. Lessa stepped forward fearlessly. Tendrils of soft light reached up, brushing the air around her, not touching her, merely welcoming. Seema knelt to her level. "You don't have to go in," she said. "Just being here might be enough." Lessa shook her head. "No, she's waiting." "The keeper?" Nara asked. Lessa smiled. "The keeper. She said I'm like her, that I hear the pieces." The crew looked at one another in shock. Was the aperture selecting, choosing, calling to specific kinds of minds? Before they could form a plan, the palimpsest pulsed 3 symbols: guide, child, inherit. Nara swallowed hard. This is more than we thought. But Lessa was already stepping forward. The aperture parted like a curtain of mercury, just enough for her foot to hover above the surface. And then, a voice. Soft, clear, familiar in the deepest possible way. "It's all right." The words weren't heard through ears, they rang inside bones. Mara's voice. Changed, layered, echoing with the cadence of 1,000 memories intertwined, but undeniably Mara. Jiro fell to his knees. Leo covered his mouth with both hands. Nara burst into tears. Lessa walked forward. The aperture held her, cradled her, and for the first time, the palimpsest recorded a coherent phrase from the keeper. "She will learn to weave." When they connected the palimpsest to the Ariadne, a final sequence pulsed through. Not urgent, not chaotic, peaceful. The translation took hours. The meaning was simple. No archive should rely on one mind alone. A world must learn to carry what it remembers. Teach them, steward them. I hold until they can hold with me. Mara. And beneath that message, another symbol echoed. Future. The steward network shifted, grew, stabilized, threw off its earlier chaos and became something new. Not an organization, not a containment unit, not a cult. A school. A school for the art of memory, for holding trauma without collapsing, for carrying stories that would otherwise disappear, for weaving fragments into meaning. Lessa became the first apprentice keeper. Others would come after her. The palimpsest remained tethered as a bridge. The Ariadne became the flagship of the steward fleet. Its crew were treated with reverence everywhere they went. And Harbor became a pilgrimage. Not for glory, not for danger, not for miracles, but for closure. People who had lost parents, children, homes, years, wars. People broken by emptiness. People needing a place to leave their grief. They came to Harbor, and the keeper held it. Gently, patiently, endlessly. In her final years, Seema wrote, "We once feared the aperture would rewrite us. Instead, it taught us a final truth. Stories do not become dangerous when shared. They become dangerous when forgotten." Jiro carved his last boat and left it at the lip of Harbor. Lio found peace in teaching apprentices how to tell memory from influence. Nara dedicated her life to understanding identity as a shared space. And every so often, the palimpsest would pulse with a familiar symbol. Mara holds still. The final entry in the ledger reads, "The aperture is not a monster, nor a miracle. It is a harbor, and some harbors do not moor ships, they moor souls. If you stand at the lip and listen very closely, you may hear the tide of memories turning, soft, endless, patient. That is the sound of the keeper breathing. The end of this story, but not of Harbor."